An empire can die so quietly that people keep buying bread beneath its windows. Before you close your eyes tonight, imagine Istanbul in the last blue hour before darkness. The Bosphorus lies between two continents like a long piece of silk, moving softly under the evening wind. On one side is Europe, on the other is Asia. Between them, ferries cross the water with lamps glowing in their windows, while gulls cry above the domes, the minarets, and the old palace walls, where sultans once believed they stood at the center of the world. For more than 600 years, the Ottoman Empire had stretched across an enormous part of the earth. It ruled over cities, deserts, mountains, islands, ports, holy places, farms, markets, and ancient roads. Its armies had marched through the Balkans. Its fleets had crossed the Mediterranean. Its officials had governed Arabs, Turks, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, Kurds, Slavs, Albanians, Bulgarians, Serbs, Bosnians, and many others. It had frightened Vienna, challenged Venice, guarded Mecca and Medina, and shaped the lives of millions of people who never once saw the face of the Sultan, whose name appeared on their coins and official papers. But the story we are entering tonight is not the story of a sudden collapse. It is not a tale of one final battle, one burning palace, or one dramatic night when everything ended at once. It is the slower, stranger, more human story of an empire growing old. The Ottoman Empire did not fall asleep as a weak thing. It fell asleep as an old giant, heavy with memory. It still had ceremonies, soldiers, governors, scholars, palaces, calligraphers, railway stations, telegraph wires, schools, taxes, prayers, and official seals. It still looked magnificent from a distance. Yet beneath that surface, the world had begun to change faster than the empire could change with it. Europe was becoming stronger. Russia pressed from the north. National movements stirred in the Balkans. Foreign banks lent money that would become chains. Reformers tried to rebuild the state. Sultans tried to preserve authority. Young officers dreamed of rescue. Ordinary families tried to live through it all, carrying water, opening shops, sending sons to war, and watching borders move across their lives. Tonight, we will drift through that long twilight. We will begin with the memory of Ottoman greatness, when the empire still remembered itself as young, victorious, and chosen by history. Then we will feel the slow pressure from Europe, the painful reforms, the destruction of the Janissaries, the age of Tanzimat, the awakening of nations in the Balkans, the suspicious reign of Abdulhamid II, the hopeful but fragile Young Turk revolution, the disaster of the Balkan Wars, the terrible gamble of World War I, the occupation of Istanbul, and finally the quiet departure of the last Sultan. This is a story of power, fear, reform, debt, identity, exile, and memory. It is also a bedtime story about time itself, because every empire believes for a while that it will last forever. But history has a patient hand. It does not always strike. Sometimes it only waits. It waits beside harbors. It waits in ministries. It waits in treaties, in unpaid debts, in school books, in barracks, in the dreams of young officers, and in the grief of people forced to leave homes their families had known for centuries. So settle in. Let the room become still. Let the old maps unfold slowly in the dark. And let us begin beside the Bosphorus, where an empire that once ruled 3 continents started to fade, not with a scream, but with a sigh. To understand the end of the Ottoman Empire, we must first remember what it had once been. Long before the final Sultan left Istanbul by sea, long before foreign warships stood in the waters near the imperial capital, long before the name Turkey appeared on the modern map as a republic, there was a frontier world in northwestern Anatolia. It was a rugged and restless place, shaped by hills, pastures, fortresses, villages, and the broken edges of older empires. The Byzantine Empire, once the eastern continuation of Rome, still existed, but it was no longer the vast power it had been. Its borders had weakened. Its towns were vulnerable. Its old authority had become thin in the lands where warriors, herders, settlers, and small rulers searched for opportunity. In that uncertain world, the House of Osman began. At first, there was no great imperial destiny visible from the outside. The early Ottomans were not yet masters of continents. They were border leaders, fighters, negotiators, builders of alliances, and gatherers of men. They lived in a world where loyalty could be personal, religious, tribal, practical, and temporary all at once. Their strength came not from marble palaces or ancient crowns, but from movement. They knew how to expand into spaces where older powers were tired. They knew how to absorb rivals, reward followers, and turn small victories into larger possibilities. History often begins in places that seem unimportant at the time. A small principality becomes a regional power. A regional power becomes a state. A state becomes an empire. Later, when historians look back, the path can seem almost inevitable. But to those living through it, nothing was guaranteed. There were always enemies, accidents, betrayals, and dangers. The Ottoman rise was not a straight road. It was a long series of decisions, battles, marriages, sieges, alliances, and recoveries. By the 14th century, the Ottomans had crossed into Europe. That crossing mattered enormously. The empire that would one day be remembered as deeply connected to Anatolia and the Middle East also became, very early, a European power. Its armies moved into the Balkans. Its rulers built new centers of control. Its soldiers took towns and fortresses. Its administrators learned to govern Christian populations as well as Muslim ones. Over time, the empire became a layered world, neither simply Eastern nor Western, neither only Asian nor European, but something wider and more complicated. Then came the moment that changed everything. In the year 1453, Constantinople fell. For more than 1,000 years, Constantinople had been one of the most desired cities on earth. Founded as the New Rome, protected by mighty walls, crowned with churches, palaces, cisterns, markets, and imperial memories, it had survived sieges that destroyed lesser cities. It stood at the meeting point of seas and continents. Whoever held it could look toward Europe, Asia, the Black Sea, and the Mediterranean with a kind of natural authority. Sultan Mehmed II took the city after a historic siege and transformed the Ottoman state forever. He did not merely capture a prize, he claimed an inheritance. Constantinople became the Ottoman capital. In time, it would be known to the world as Istanbul. The city was not left as a corpse of the Byzantine past. It was revived, repopulated, rebuilt, and made into the beating heart of a new imperial order. Mosques rose beside older churches, markets filled. Craftsmen, scholars, merchants, soldiers, and officials came. Greek, Armenian, Jewish, Turkish, Arab, Persian, Slavic, and Italian voices could be heard in its streets. The city became a place where memory did not disappear, but changed rulers. From that point onward, the Ottoman Sultan was no longer only the leader of a rising dynasty. He was the ruler of a city emperors had dreamed of possessing. He could present himself as a successor to Rome, a defender of Islam, and the master of one of the great crossroads of the world. The empire grew. In the 16th century, under Suleiman the Magnificent, Ottoman power reached one of its most brilliant heights. Suleiman ruled over a state that was feared, admired, negotiated with, and watched carefully by the other powers of the age. Ottoman armies moved deep into Central Europe and stood before Vienna. Ottoman fleets fought in the Mediterranean. Ottoman law, architecture, poetry, administration, and court culture reached a high level of refinement. The empire was not only a machine of conquest, it was also a world of order. In Istanbul, the palace was a universe of ceremony, discipline, education, silence, and ambition. In the provinces, governors, judges, tax collectors, soldiers, religious scholars, merchants, and local notables helped maintain the complicated life of the empire. In a Balkan village, a Christian farmer might pay taxes to Ottoman authorities while continuing to worship in his own church. In Cairo, scholars taught in old mosques, beneath the shadow of a city that had known many dynasties. In Damascus, caravans arrived with goods, stories, dust, and news. In Salonika, Jewish communities expelled from Spain found refuge and built thriving lives under Ottoman rule. In Aleppo, merchants linked the empire to trade routes stretching far beyond its borders. The Ottoman system was not modern in the way people understand the word today. It did not imagine a nation of equal citizens speaking one language and sharing one identity. It ruled through hierarchy, community, religion, privilege, service, and negotiation. Different groups had different roles and obligations. Different regions had different customs. Diversity was not managed through modern nationalism, but through imperial practice. For a long time, this system worked well enough. It did not mean life was peaceful for everyone. No empire is innocent. There were heavy taxes, local abuses, forced service, rebellion, war, slavery, inequality, and violence. Yet the empire had a remarkable ability to endure. People were born, married, traded, prayed, argued, farmed, sailed, cooked, and died inside its borders. To many of them, the Ottoman world must have seemed as permanent as the mountains, the sea, or the seasons. This is one of the quiet illusions of history. People living inside a powerful order often cannot imagine its ending. The institutions around them feel natural. The coins, seals, uniforms, prayers, roads, taxes, and official titles seem to belong to the structure of life itself. An empire becomes the weather. It becomes the background against which ordinary people measure their days. But time moves beneath the surface. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the Ottoman Empire was still vast, still impressive, and still deeply important. The Sultan still ruled from the imperial city. The mosques still shone in the sun. The ceremonies still carried the weight of centuries. The maps still showed enormous territories stretching through southeastern Europe, Anatolia, the Arab lands, and North Africa. Yet beyond the surface, the balance of the world was changing. European states were becoming more centralized. Their armies were changing in discipline, organization, and technology. Their navies were crossing oceans and building global trade networks. Banks, insurance houses, joint stock companies, colonial wealth, printing presses, scientific institutions, and new military systems were helping some European powers grow stronger at a remarkable pace. The Ottomans were not blind to this. Ottoman officials knew that Europe was changing. They sent envoys. They read reports. They watched new weapons, new tactics, new fortifications, and new methods of administration. They understood that the world of the early modern age was not the world of Suleiman. But understanding change and mastering change are different things. The empire was enormous, and enormous things are difficult to turn. Every reform touched old interests. Every new army threatened old soldiers. Every new tax system angered local powers. Every new school raised questions about who should guide the minds of the young. Every attempt to centralize authority disturbed people who had grown comfortable with distance from the capital. The empire could move, but it moved slowly, like a great ship turning in a narrow strait, while the current pushed hard against its side. There was also the burden of memory. The Ottomans remembered greatness because greatness had been real. They remembered victories, sieges, holy cities, imperial law, and the splendor of the court. Such memory can give a state confidence. It can help people endure hardship, but it can also become a soft pillow. It can encourage a ruler, a minister, or an army to sleep a little longer than the age allows. By the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire was not yet doomed. That is important to understand. History was not already written. Decline was not a curse placed upon it by fate. The empire still had resources, people, land, skills, and possibilities. It still contained men and women of intelligence, courage, faith, and imagination. It could still win wars. It could still negotiate. It could still reform. But the margin for error was shrinking. The empire had entered a world in which speed mattered more than before. Information traveled faster. Armies mobilized differently. Money moved across borders. Ideas spread through books, schools, newspapers, and secret societies. European power no longer came only with swords and cannons. It came with banks, diplomats, engineers, missionaries, merchants, advisors, and maps. The old giant still stood, but the ground beneath him was no longer the same ground. And this is where the long twilight begins, not with collapse, but with unease. A great empire looked back on its youth and saw glory. It looked around and saw danger. It looked forward and saw a future it could not clearly name. Somewhere in Istanbul, a scribe dipped his pen into ink. Somewhere in the Balkans, a village priest taught children old songs that would one day become national songs. Somewhere near the Black Sea, Russian ambitions pressed southward. Somewhere in a palace chamber, an Ottoman statesman wondered how much of the old order could be saved by changing it. The empire was still awake, but the dreams of its youth had begun to fade. And beyond the Bosphorus, Europe was gathering pressure like a storm beyond the horizon. There are pressures that do not sound like thunder. They arrive as letters, treaties, maps, loans, envoys, military reports, and quiet conversations behind polished doors. They arrive as a fortress surrendered after a winter siege. They arrive as a foreign ambassador who stays too long, asks too much, and speaks as though the future of an empire is already being discussed elsewhere. For the Ottoman Empire, Europe had not always been a source of pressure. For centuries, Europe had been a battlefield, a trading partner, a rival, a borderland, and often a frightened neighbor. Ottoman armies had crossed the Balkans with confidence. Ottoman diplomats had spoken to kings and emperors as equals. Ottoman ships had moved through the Mediterranean with force. In the 16th century, the empire did not look westward with inferiority. It looked westward with the certainty of a power that had won, ruled, taxed, and endured. But time slowly changed the balance. By the 18th century, Europe was no longer the same fragmented world the early Ottoman conquerors had known. Its states were learning to count people, collect taxes, build navies, train armies, and organize war with new precision. Its rulers and ministers increasingly understood that power did not depend only on courage in battle. It depended on finance, bureaucracy, discipline, industry, artillery, roads, ports, and information. The Ottoman Empire still had courage. It still had soldiers. It still had territory and prestige. But the machinery of power around it was changing, and changing quickly. The empire began to lose not only battles, but confidence. This did not happen in one dramatic moment. Decline is rarely honest enough to announce itself. It entered through small defeats and uneasy compromises. A fortress was lost. A province became difficult to govern. A treaty acknowledged what no one in Istanbul wished to admit. A rival power gained access to a sea, a port, or a diplomatic privilege. Each event could be explained. Each wound could be survived. Yet together, over decades, they formed a pattern. To the north, Russia became the most persistent shadow. Russian rulers dreamed of warm water ports, access to the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, influence over Orthodox Christians, and perhaps, in the deepest corners of imperial imagination, the ancient prize of Constantinople itself. Russia was vast, ambitious, and increasingly dangerous. It pressed southward again and again through war, diplomacy, and claims of protection. For the Ottomans, Russia was not merely another enemy. It was a pressure that returned generation after generation. A war might end. A treaty might be signed. Ambassadors might exchange formal words. But the direction of Russian ambition remained. It leaned toward the Black Sea. It leaned toward the Balkans. It leaned toward the warm routes of the south. Every Ottoman statesman understood what this meant. If Russia reached too far, Istanbul itself might one day be threatened. The Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, those narrow waters that connected seas and continents, were not only beautiful, they were strategic arteries. Whoever controlled them could shape the movement of fleets, trade, and empires. To the west, the Habsburg lands and other European powers watched the Balkans. These provinces had been Ottoman for centuries, but they were filled with Christian populations whose loyalties could become the subject of foreign concern. In earlier centuries, the Sultan had treated these communities as subjects of his own empire. Now, increasingly, European rulers spoke as though they had a right to care for them, advise them, protect them, and sometimes use them. Protection was a dangerous word. It sounded moral. It sounded generous. But in the language of empire, protection often meant influence. A great power could claim to protect a religious community, then demand diplomatic privileges, then interfere in internal affairs, then support rebellion, then insist that Ottoman sovereignty had become a problem for civilization itself. To the seas, Britain and France brought a different kind of pressure. They did not always want the Ottoman Empire destroyed. In fact, at times, they wanted it preserved. But they wanted it preserved in a useful condition, not too strong, not too independent, not able to close trade routes, and not available for Russia to swallow. Britain cared deeply about routes to India and influence in the Eastern Mediterranean. France cared about prestige, commerce, Catholic communities, and cultural influence. Both powers looked at Ottoman lands not only as places where people lived, but as spaces on a global chessboard. This was the strange fate of the empire in its later centuries. It was too important to ignore. It was too weak to command complete respect. It was too large to be allowed to collapse without every nearby power asking what might be gained from its ruins. European diplomats called this problem the Eastern Question. The phrase sounds calm, almost scholarly, like something discussed over tea in a quiet room. But beneath the words lay fear, ambition, greed, strategy, religion, and the knowledge that the fall of the Ottoman Empire could reorder the world. The question was simple only on paper. What would happen when the Ottoman Empire finally broke apart? Who would control the Balkans? Who would dominate the Black Sea? Who would rule the Arab provinces? Who would protect the holy places? Who would gain influence over trade routes, ports, railways, and future markets? Who would inherit the shadow of the Sultan? For the Ottomans themselves, the Eastern Question was not a question. It was a threat disguised as diplomacy. In Istanbul, ministers and reformers understood that survival required change. They were not ignorant men watching the world pass by like villagers staring at a train. Many Ottoman officials knew Europe well enough to fear it intelligently. They studied military organization. They sent students and envoys abroad. They invited advisors. They debated reform in palace chambers, government offices, schools, and private circles. They understood that the empire needed a stronger army, a more reliable tax system, modern schools, improved administration, better roads, better communications, and a more direct connection between the center and the provinces. But to know what must be done is not the same as being able to do it. Every reform disturbed somebody. A new army threatened old military groups that had built their identity on privilege. A new tax system threatened provincial notables who profited from confusion and distance. A new court system threatened older legal habits. A new school threatened scholars who feared foreign ideas. A new ministry threatened men whose power came from personal access, tradition, and patronage. Even the most necessary reform could feel, to those losing status, like betrayal. This was one of the deepest Ottoman dilemmas. The empire needed to modernize to survive European pressure, yet the act of modernization often created new internal resistance. Reform was medicine, but medicine could weaken the patient before it healed him. So the empire moved in a rhythm that became tragically familiar. Defeat, alarm, reform, resistance, delay, another defeat. Again and again, the same pattern returned. After a military disaster, urgency filled the capital. Statesmen spoke of discipline, science, training, and new institutions. The Sultan might approve changes. Foreign experts might be invited. Young men might be sent to learn. But then the immediate danger passed, and old interests pushed back. Money ran short. Local resistance grew. Suspicion spread. The state adjusted, compromised, and slowed. From the outside, later observers sometimes described the Ottoman Empire as sleeping. But this is not quite fair. It was not simply asleep. It was struggling to wake while wrapped in centuries of habit. In the streets of Istanbul, life continued with a calm that could hide the depth of the crisis. At dawn, bakers pulled warm loaves from ovens. Water carriers moved through neighborhoods. Porters bent beneath heavy loads at the docks. Merchants opened shutters in the bazaars. Women visited fountains, courtyards, and markets. Children chased one another through narrow lanes. Scribes copied official papers in careful hands. Students recited lessons. Soldiers waited in barracks. Cats slept in the sunlight on stones worn smooth by generations of feet. No empire feels like it is dying to the people buying bread inside it. The state may be losing a frontier, but the fish still arrive at the market. A treaty may be signed in a distant capital, but a mother still lights the evening lamp. A province may be restless, but a groom still waits nervously for his wedding day. History, when lived from within, is rarely as clean as the maps that later describe it. Still, beneath ordinary life, anxiety gathered. Ottoman officials felt watched. Every weakness invited foreign comment. Every rebellion became an international issue. Every massacre, every reform decree, every unpaid debt, every provincial complaint could become part of a European debate about the future of the empire. The Sultan still ruled, but foreign ambassadors grew more influential. The empire still collected taxes, but foreign creditors would one day look over its finances. The army still marched, but officers knew that European weapons and training had changed the meaning of war. The old imperial dignity remained, but it had to share the room with dependents. This is how great powers age. Not always through one catastrophic defeat, but through the slow narrowing of choices. A young empire acts. An old empire reacts. A young empire expands because it sees opportunities. An old empire negotiates because it sees dangers on every side. By the early 19th century, the Ottoman state faced a terrible truth. It could not return to the world of Suleiman. Memory could inspire, but it could not stop Russian armies, European banks, nationalist schools, or modern artillery. The empire had to change, and change deeply, or continue to lose ground piece by piece. Yet the greatest obstacle to reform was not only outside the empire. It stood near the very heart of Ottoman power. For centuries, one military institution had symbolized the Sultan's strength. It had once been disciplined, feared, and central to conquest. But by the age of reform, it had become something very different: proud, privileged, resistant, and dangerous. The empire needed a modern army. But the old army stood in the way. And soon, in the streets of Istanbul, the struggle between survival and tradition would turn violent. At the center of the Ottoman Empire stood an old and dangerous question. How do you save a state when one of the institutions that once made it powerful has become one of the reasons it cannot change? For centuries, the Janissaries had been among the most famous soldiers in the world. Their name carried the memory of discipline, loyalty, and fear. They had stood near the heart of Ottoman conquest. They had marched with sultans, guarded the imperial center, and helped turn a frontier principality into a world empire. In the great centuries of Ottoman expansion, they were not merely soldiers. They were a symbol of the Sultan's will. Their origins belong to a very different age. The Janissary Corps had developed as an elite infantry force, tied closely to the Ottoman ruler. In earlier centuries, young boys, often taken through the Div Shermi system from Christian families in the Balkans, were converted, educated, trained, and placed into imperial service. Some became soldiers. Others entered the palace or administration. The system was harsh and, to modern eyes, deeply troubling. But within the Ottoman structure, it created a class of men whose loyalty was meant to belong not to tribe, family, or province, but to the Sultan himself. In their prime, the Janissaries were disciplined and formidable. They trained together. They lived under strict rules. They used firearms effectively when many older cavalry traditions were struggling to adjust. They stood at sieges. They fought in great campaigns. They became one of the reasons Ottoman armies could compete so successfully across continents. But time changes institutions from within. A corps built for discipline can become a corps built for privilege. A force created to serve the state can become a force that the state fears. By the 18th and early 19th centuries, the Janissaries were no longer the sharp edge of Ottoman military power. Many had become involved in trade, urban life, guild politics, and local influence. Membership became less strictly controlled than it had once been. The corps was no longer simply a battlefield institution. It had become part of the social and political fabric of Ottoman cities, especially Istanbul. This gave it strength, but not the kind of strength the empire needed. The Janissaries could still riot. They could still intimidate. They could still help make or break a sultan. They could still defend their privileges with ferocity, but they could not reliably defeat the modern armies that the empire increasingly faced on its borders. This was the bitter irony. The Ottoman Empire needed military reform because European armies were changing, but the most famous old military body in the empire resisted reform because real reform threatened its existence. Several sultans saw the problem. Several tried to create new forces, modernize training, introduce European drill, or improve artillery and organization. Yet every attempt touched a nerve. The Janissaries did not see reform as an abstract idea. They saw it as a direct attack on their honor, income, and place in the empire. Religious conservatives, urban groups, and political factions could join their resistance. A reforming sultan might suddenly find that the old soldiers in the capital were not his servants, but his enemies. The empire therefore entered the 19th century with a military heart divided against itself. Outside, Russia pressed southward. European armies grew more professional. War became more technical, more organized, more expensive. Inside, the old corps guarded its privileges like a man gripping the keys to a house that was already on fire. Then came Sultan Mahmud II. Mahmud was a ruler formed by danger. He knew that a sultan who moved too quickly could be overthrown. He knew that the Janissaries had destroyed reform before. He understood that the Ottoman state could not be rebuilt, while an armed institution in the capital had the power to block every serious change. He waited. Patience can be one of the coldest forms of power. Mahmud did not rush blindly into confrontation. He studied his enemies. He strengthened loyal forces. He prepared the ground. He watched the Janissaries and the world around them. He understood that if he challenged them and failed, he might not merely lose a reform project. He might lose his throne, and perhaps his life. By 1826, the moment had arrived. The Sultan announced the creation of a new military force, trained along modern lines. To the Janissaries, this was the old threat made real. They rose in rebellion, as they had done before. They overturned their cooking cauldrons, a traditional sign of revolt. They expected the familiar rhythm of Ottoman politics: pressure, fear, negotiation, concession, and survival. But this time, the rhythm broke. Mahmud was ready. Loyal troops and artillery units moved against the Janissary barracks. The confrontation did not unfold as a ceremonial dispute. It became a violent breaking of an old order. Cannons were turned on the Janissaries in the capital itself. Smoke rose over Istanbul. Fire and confusion filled the air. Men who had believed themselves untouchable were killed, captured, scattered, or executed. A corps that had existed for centuries was destroyed in a matter of days. The event became known as the Auspicious Incident. The name has an eerie calmness. It sounds almost gentle, as if describing a fortunate turn in the weather. Yet behind it was blood, fire, terror, and the deliberate destruction of one of the empire's oldest institutions. The Ottoman state had cut into its own body to remove what it believed had become a deadly obstruction. Afterward, Mahmud moved quickly. The Janissaries were abolished. Their name was condemned. Their networks were attacked. Their symbols were erased. Their associated religious brotherhoods and social structures were weakened or suppressed. The Sultan wanted to make sure that the corps could not return in another form, wearing old memories like armor. A new army began to take shape. Its uniforms looked different. Its training looked different. Its officers studied different methods. European military models became more important. Drill, discipline, artillery, logistics, and command structures were reorganized. The Ottoman soldier of the future would no longer be imagined as a warrior of the old imperial age, but as part of a modern state, struggling to survive among modern states. Yet reform by destruction has its own cost. The empire had removed a great obstacle, but it had also admitted something frightening. It had shown that modernization might require violence, not only against foreign enemies, but against the empire's own traditions. The past could no longer be treated only with reverence. Some parts of it had to be broken. For many people, this must have felt like the world turning upside down. Older men remembered when the Janissaries had been feared and honored. Merchants had known them as customers, partners, protectors, or bullies. Neighborhoods had lived with their presence. Political factions had depended on them. Now, suddenly, their barracks were ruins, their name dangerous, their privileges gone. In Istanbul, daily life resumed, as it always does after shock. The smoke cleared, shops reopened, boats crossed the Bosphorus. Bread was baked, prayers were recited, officials returned to offices. But the city had changed. A pillar of the old Ottoman world had fallen, and everyone could feel that the state was entering a harsher age. Mahmud II did not stop with the army. He understood that military reform alone could not save the empire. A modern army required a modern administration to feed it, pay it, supply it, and command it. That meant ministries, records, taxes, schools, and officials. It meant greater central control. It meant reaching deeper into provinces that had long enjoyed distance from Istanbul. It meant remaking the state itself. The Sultan also changed the appearance of authority. Clothing, ceremony, and administration began to shift. The old robes and turbans of certain official worlds gave way, in some settings, to new uniforms and styles. Symbols mattered. The empire was trying to tell itself and others that it was no longer frozen in the past. But symbols could not solve every problem. A new army could be created by decree, but it took years to train officers, build trust, organize supplies, and establish discipline. New institutions could be announced, but they required money. Money required taxation. Taxation required control. Control required officials. Officials required schools. Schools produced new ideas. New ideas produced new demands. Reform was not a single door. It was a corridor leading to many more doors, each one opening into another chamber of difficulty. And beyond the military problem lay something even deeper. What did it mean to belong to the Ottoman Empire in the modern age? For centuries, the empire had governed communities through religion, status, local arrangements, and negotiated loyalty. But the 19th century was bringing new political languages. People were beginning to speak of rights, constitutions, nations, citizens, equality, liberty, and representation. These words could not be kept outside the empire. They traveled through schools, ports, books, embassies, merchants, missionaries, soldiers, and exiles. The Ottoman state could modernize its army, but could it modernize loyalty? Could a Greek merchant, an Armenian craftsman, an Arab notable, a Bulgarian teacher, a Kurdish tribal leader, a Turkish officer, and a Jewish shopkeeper all be made to feel part of the same political future? Could the Sultan become not only a sacred ruler and imperial master, but the head of a modern state? Could equality be promised without tearing apart the hierarchy on which the old empire had rested? These questions waited beyond the smoke of the Janissary barracks. Mahmud had won a battle against the past, but he had not defeated the future. The empire still faced Russia. It still faced Europe. It still faced debt, provincial unrest, nationalist ideas, administrative weakness, and the slow erosion of old certainties. The destruction of the Janissaries was therefore both an ending and a beginning. It ended the age in which one ancient military corps could hold reform hostage in the capital. It began an age in which the Ottoman state would try, with increasing urgency, to reorganize itself from within. Soon, imperial decrees would promise security, law, order, and a new relationship between ruler and subject. The empire would speak in the language of reform more boldly than ever before. It would try to become modern while remaining Ottoman. equal while remaining imperial, centralized while ruling over immense diversity. This next age would be called the Tanzimat, and like so many things in the Ottoman Twilight, it would be filled with hope, contradiction, beauty, and sorrow. After the smoke of the Janissary barracks faded from Istanbul, the Ottoman Empire stood in a strange and fragile silence. An old obstacle had been destroyed. A new army was being built. The Sultan had shown that the state could still act with terrifying force when survival demanded it. But the destruction of the Janissaries had answered only one question. It had not answered the larger one. How could an empire of many peoples, many languages, many religions, many memories, and many grievances survive in a century that was beginning to worship the idea of the nation? The answer, or at least the attempt at an answer, came in the age of reform known as the Tanzimat. The word means reorganization. It sounds orderly, almost gentle, like papers being sorted on a desk. But in reality, the Tanzimat was one of the most ambitious and difficult projects in Ottoman history. It was an effort to remake the empire from within before outside powers and internal unrest pulled it apart. The age began formally in 1839, after the death of Sultan Mahmud II, with the proclamation of the Hat-i-Sharif of Gulhain. The setting mattered. Gulhain was a garden near Topkapi Palace, a place of trees, paths, and imperial memory. There, in the shadow of the old palace world, Ottoman officials announced promises that belonged to a new political age. The decree promised security of life, honor, and property for the subjects of the empire. It promised more regular taxation. It promised a more orderly system of military service. It suggested that justice should be applied with greater consistency. Most importantly, it hinted at a new idea of belonging, that all subjects of the Sultan, Muslim and non-Muslim alike, might be protected under a shared imperial law. This was a profound shift. For centuries, Ottoman society had been organized through hierarchy and community. Muslims held a privileged place. Non-Muslim communities, especially Christians and Jews, had their own religious institutions, leaders, customs, and legal arrangements. This system had allowed diversity to survive, but not through equality in the modern sense. It worked through difference, status, protection, obligation, and negotiation. The Tanzimat reformers looked at this old structure and saw both strength and danger. Its strength was flexibility. It had allowed the empire to govern many kinds of people across vast distances. Its danger was that the 19th century was changing what people expected from political life. European ideas of citizenship, rights, representation, and national identity were spreading. Christian subjects in the Balkans were increasingly influenced by foreign powers, schools, churches, and nationalist histories. Muslim subjects, meanwhile, feared that equality with non-Muslims might mean the loss of their own inherited status. The empire needed loyalty from all, but every effort to create that loyalty disturbed someone. The reformers were trying to balance things that did not easily balance. They wanted the empire to be modern, but not conquered by European influence. They wanted all subjects to feel Ottoman, but not to erase religion and community overnight. They wanted equality before law, but not social chaos. They wanted central authority, but not endless provincial revolt. They wanted European respect, but not European control. It was like trying to rebuild a house during a storm while the family inside argued over the blueprint. In Istanbul, the Tanzimat changed the atmosphere of government. New ministries grew in importance. New councils discussed law, finance, education, and administration. Bureaucrats became central figures in the empire's survival. The pen became as important as the sword. A man trained in languages, law, accounting, and diplomacy could shape the fate of provinces as surely as a general on campaign. Schools became essential. The empire needed engineers, doctors, officers, translators, administrators, and diplomats who could understand the new world. Young men studied French, mathematics, military science, medicine, geography, law, and political ideas. Some traveled abroad. Others learned from foreign instructors inside the empire. A new Ottoman official class began to form, polished by paperwork, trained in reform, and deeply aware of Europe's power. They were modernizers, but they were also imperial servants. They did not want to surrender the empire. They wanted to save it. They believed that reform could strengthen the Sultan's state, restore dignity, and prevent foreign intervention. They hoped that if the empire treated its subjects more fairly, Europe would have fewer excuses to interfere. They hoped that if Christians and Muslims alike felt protected by law, separatist movements might weaken. They hoped that if taxation became more regular, military service more organized, and administration more centralized, the empire might stand again among the great powers. Hope, however, is never enough. The Tanzimat reforms reached into the provinces unevenly. A decree proclaimed in Istanbul did not automatically transform a village in Anatolia, a mountain district in Albania, a market town in Syria, or a Christian community in Bulgaria. Roads were poor, officials could be corrupt, local notables resisted, old habits continued. Peasants often experienced reform not as noble language, but as new taxes, new conscription demands, and new officials arriving with papers. To the state, centralization meant survival. To many local powers, centralization meant intrusion. For generations, provincial notables had collected taxes, maintained influence, negotiated with governors, and ruled local society with a great deal of practical autonomy. When Istanbul tried to regularize administration, it threatened these arrangements. A stronger state might bring order, but it also brought inspection, measurement, and control. Modern government often begins by counting. It counts people. It counts land. It counts money. It counts soldiers. It counts animals, fields, households, debts, and sons old enough to serve. To officials in the capital, counting made reform possible. To villagers and local leaders, counting could feel like a hand reaching through the door. The reforms also created tension between Muslims and non-Muslims. When the state promised equality, many Christian subjects welcomed the language, but doubted the reality. They had heard promises before. They wanted protection from abuse, access to office, fair courts, and security. Some hoped for genuine Ottoman citizenship. Others saw reform as a step toward autonomy or independence. Many Muslim subjects heard the same promises with unease. If Christians were now equal before the law, what happened to the old social order? Had the empire changed its character? Was European pressure forcing the Sultan to favor non-Muslims? Were ancient privileges being traded away for diplomatic approval? Thus, the Tanzimat tried to create unity, but often revealed division. Foreign powers made everything more difficult. Russia claimed special concern for Orthodox Christians. France spoke of Catholic interests. Britain spoke of trade, stability, and the balance of power. Each power presented itself as a guardian of justice, civilization, or order, yet each also pursued influence. A complaint from a local Christian community could become a diplomatic issue. A reform promise could become a foreign demand. A massacre or uprising could become an excuse for intervention. The empire's internal life was increasingly exposed to outside judgment. This was one of the humiliations of the age. The Ottoman state was sovereign, but not fully free. It could announce reforms, yet European governments would measure whether those reforms were acceptable. It could punish rebels, but foreign consuls might protest. It could negotiate taxes, but foreign creditors would later demand payment. It could rule, but it was being watched. The Crimean War in the 1850s briefly seemed to restore Ottoman importance. Russia's pressure became too threatening for Britain and France, and they joined the Ottoman Empire in war against the Russian Empire. Soldiers from Western Europe came to fight on Ottoman soil. Newspapers reported from the front. The empire was suddenly not isolated, but part of a grand coalition. The war ended with Russia checked, and the Ottoman Empire preserved. But preservation by foreign help carried a hidden price. The war deepened the empire's dependence on European finance. Modern armies, weapons, roads, ports, and administration required money, and the Ottoman treasury was strained. Foreign loans became tempting. At first, Borrowing seemed like a bridge to survival. Money could pay soldiers, fund reforms, and keep the state functioning. But debt is a quiet conqueror. It does not arrive with drums. It arrives with signatures. Over time, Ottoman debt grew heavier. Interest payments mounted. Financial dependence gave Europe another form of power over the empire. A lost battle could take a province. A debt could take the future. Still, it would be unfair to call the Tanzimat a failure in a simple way. The reforms created institutions that mattered deeply. They trained officials who would shape late Ottoman politics and later the modern Turkish state. They expanded education. They introduced new legal concepts. They changed the language of government. They created newspapers, discussions, and public debates that helped form a new political consciousness. The empire was no longer only an old dynastic order. It was becoming a state that spoke of law, rights, reform, and citizenship, even when it could not fully deliver them. This is the tragedy of the Tanzimat. It was both necessary and insufficient. It was too bold for those who feared change, and too cautious for those who demanded justice. It gave hope to some, fear to others, and satisfaction to almost no one. It modernized the empire, but also awakened expectations the empire could not easily meet. It strengthened the center, but increased resentment. It promised Ottoman unity, while nationalism grew stronger in the provinces. In the coffee houses of Istanbul, men read newspapers and argued about reform. In government offices, clerks copied decrees in careful script. In provincial towns, new officials arrived with laws and instructions. In villages, peasants wondered why reform so often meant another demand from the state. In foreign embassies, diplomats read every Ottoman promise through the lens of their own ambitions. The empire had begun to speak the language of modernity. But modernity did not come alone. It brought schools, railways, ministries, and law codes. It also brought nationalism, debt, intervention, and impatience. By the late 19th century, one idea was moving through the Ottoman lands with increasing force. It moved in songs, maps, classrooms, churches, newspapers, and secret societies. It told people that they were not merely subjects of a sultan. They were members of a nation. They had a past of their own, heroes of their own, and perhaps a future outside the empire. For a state made of many peoples, this idea was more dangerous than any cannon. And nowhere would it shake the empire more deeply than in the Balkans. The Balkans did not leave the Ottoman Empire in silence. They left through songs, sermons, school books, uprisings, massacres, treaties, foreign interventions, burned villages, refugee roads, and the slow awakening of people who began to imagine themselves not simply as subjects of a sultan, but as members of nations. For centuries, the Balkans had been one of the oldest and most important regions of Ottoman rule. These lands were not a distant edge of the empire. They were woven into its body. Ottoman armies had crossed into Europe early in the empire's rise. Ottoman cities, roads, tax systems, mosques, churches, markets, and military networks had shaped life there for generations. Many Ottoman officials, soldiers, and families came from Balkan backgrounds. The empire's European provinces were not merely possessions on a map. They were part of the Ottoman memory of itself. And yet, by the 19th century, that memory was beginning to break apart. The Balkans were a mosaic of extraordinary complexity. In one valley, there might be Muslim landlords, Orthodox Christian peasants, Jewish merchants, and traveling craftsmen speaking several languages. In a mountain district, local clan loyalties might matter more than imperial decrees. In a port city, Greek, Turkish, Slavic, Albanian, Ladino, Italian, and French words might drift together in the air. Religion, language, village identity, class, trade, and family history overlapped in ways no clean political map could capture. For a long time, the Ottoman Empire had governed this diversity through older imperial methods. It did not require all people to become the same. It did not ask every subject to speak one language or share one national story. Communities had their religious institutions, their local leaders, their customs, their obligations, and their place within the hierarchy of the state. But the 19th century brought a new kind of imagination. The idea of the nation moved through Europe like weather. It taught people to look backward and forward in a different way. Backward, toward ancient heroes, medieval kingdoms, sacred battles, old languages, folk songs, village legends, and remembered injustices. Forward, toward the dream of a state that belonged not to a dynasty, but to a people. This idea could feel noble and liberating. It could also be explosive. A peasant who once thought of himself mainly as Orthodox Christian, as a villager, as a subject of the Sultan, or as a member of a local community, might gradually learn to imagine himself as Serbian, Greek, Bulgarian, Romanian, or another national identity in a modern sense. That change did not happen overnight. It was taught, it was printed, it was sung, it was preached, it was argued over in schools, monasteries, merchant houses, revolutionary circles, and foreign capitals. Teachers became dangerous, priests became political, poets became soldiers of memory, maps became weapons. In the Balkans, awakening was not gentle. The phrase national awakening can sound peaceful, like morning light entering a room. But inside an empire, awakening often means that one community's dream becomes another community's fear. To one people, independence may sound like justice. To another, it may sound like exile. To the imperial state, it sounds like dismemberment. The Greek War of Independence in the 1820s was one of the first great shocks. Greece held a powerful place in European imagination. Educated Europeans looked to ancient Athens, Sparta, philosophy, art, and classical civilization as part of their own cultural inheritance. When Greeks rose against Ottoman rule, their struggle captured attention far beyond the Eastern Mediterranean. Poets, volunteers, journalists, politicians, and idealists turned Greece into a romantic cause. For the Ottomans, it was rebellion. For many Europeans, it was liberation. This difference in language mattered. Empires call a rising revolt. National movements call it freedom. Foreign sympathizers call it a noble struggle. The words chosen reveal where the heart has already gone. The war was brutal. Civilians suffered. Communities feared revenge. Ottoman forces fought to hold territory. Greek fighters fought to create a state. European powers watched, debated, intervened, and finally helped shape the outcome. In time, Greece became independent. For the Ottoman Empire, the meaning was enormous. A province had broken away and become a recognized state. A Christian people had successfully turned rebellion into nationhood. European sympathy had helped transform an internal imperial crisis into an international settlement. Others noticed. The lesson moved through the Balkans with quiet force. If Greece could leave, perhaps others could too. If Europe could be persuaded to care, perhaps rebellion could become diplomacy. If the empire could be pressured, perhaps autonomy could become independence. Serbia followed a different path, but with similar consequences. Through revolt, negotiation, autonomy, and great power politics, Serbia moved step by step away from direct Ottoman control. Romania emerged from principalities that had long existed under Ottoman suzerainty, but had their own political traditions and foreign connections. Bulgaria, after cultural revival, church struggles, revolutionary activity, violent repression, and war, would also move toward autonomy and statehood. Each case was different. Each people had its own history, leaders, grievances, geography, churches, schools, foreign allies, and internal divisions. There was no single Balkan story. Yet from Istanbul, the pattern looked terrifyingly clear. The European lands of the empire were becoming less governable. Every national movement weakened the old imperial fabric. Every foreign intervention humiliated the state. Every lost province reduced tax revenue, manpower, prestige, and strategic depth. The Ottoman Empire did not merely lose land. It lost confidence in the possibility that its people still wished to share the same imperial future. This was perhaps the deepest wound. A state can recover from lost territory if it believes the rest of its people remain loyal. But what happens when loyalty itself becomes uncertain? What happens when the school teacher in a village teaches children a history that ends not in Istanbul, but in national independence? What happens when church disputes become political battles? What happens when foreign consuls listen more carefully to local grievances than the imperial governor does? What happens when young men dream of flags not yet accepted by the world? The answer, slowly, was fragmentation. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 and 1878 brought one of the most devastating shocks of the 19th century. Russia, presenting itself partly as protector of Orthodox Christians and partly pursuing its own imperial ambitions, went to war against the Ottoman Empire. The conflict was brutal and frightening. Russian armies advanced through the Balkans and into eastern Anatolia. Ottoman forces resisted, but the empire was weakened, strained, and unprepared for the scale of disaster. Refugees fled before armies. Villages burned. Families disappeared into winter roads. Rumor ran faster than official news. The war ended with the empire forced into harsh terms. The Treaty of San Stefano initially promised a vast Bulgaria under Russian influence, a result that alarmed other European powers. The settlement was revised at the Congress of Berlin in 1878, where diplomats redrew the map with careful hands and cold calculations. The Congress of Berlin limited some Russian gains, but it confirmed enormous Ottoman losses. Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro gained full independence. Bulgaria became autonomous, though divided from the larger state imagined at San Stefano. Bosnia and Herzegovina came under Austro-Hungarian administration, though formally it still had a connection to the Ottoman order. Other territories shifted status. The empire's European presence was reduced, wounded, and humiliated. In diplomatic language, balance had been restored. In Ottoman memory, another amputation had taken place. The human consequences were immense. Muslim refugees from the Balkans, often called muhachirs, poured into the remaining Ottoman lands. They came from villages, farms, towns, and neighborhoods where their families had lived for generations. Some had fled violence. Some feared revenge. Some had been forced out by new political realities. They carried bundles, keys, stories, documents, children, old parents, and grief. Imagine them arriving in Anatolia or Istanbul. A family that once had land now waits for state assistance. A mother remembers a cemetery left behind. A father keeps the key to a house that another family may now occupy. Children learn new streets, while hearing old place names spoken every night. Men who had once been secure become angry, uprooted, and suspicious. Their memories do not remain private. They become political. These refugees change the empire. They strengthened the sense among many Muslims that the Ottoman state was shrinking under Christian nationalist pressure and European intervention. They brought stories of suffering that hardened attitudes toward non-Muslim communities still inside the empire. They made the loss of territory feel intimate. The empire was no longer simply losing provinces. It was receiving the human wreckage of its losses. The Balkan question was therefore not only diplomatic or military, it became emotional. It shaped how people understood survival. For reformers who believed in Ottoman citizenship, the challenge became harder. How could the state persuade Muslims and Christians to trust one another when recent memory was filled with rebellion, massacre, exile, and foreign war? How could it promise equality when each community feared being dominated by another? How could it create a shared identity when Europe rewarded national separation? The dream of Ottomanism began to fade. Ottomanism was the idea that all subjects of the empire could belong to a common political identity, regardless of religion or ethnicity. It was not foolish. It was a serious attempt to save a diverse empire in the modern age. If people could become Ottoman citizens in a meaningful sense, perhaps nationalism could be softened. Perhaps Greeks, Armenians, Arabs, Turks, Slavs, Jews, Albanians, and others could share a state without dissolving into separate national projects. But the Balkans made that dream fragile. Every new uprising gave skeptics more evidence. Every foreign intervention made Muslims more resentful. Every unfulfilled reform made Christians more doubtful. Every lost province made the empire more defensive. And when states become defensive, they often become less generous. In Balkan towns, life continued through all of this, but with growing uncertainty. Markets still opened, weddings still took place, priests still rang bells, muezzins still called the faithful to prayer, Jewish merchants still kept accounts, farmers still watched the weather, children still learned songs from their elders. Yet beneath daily life, identities were sharpening. A neighbor's language began to matter more. A church affiliation became political. A school curriculum became a declaration of the future. A flag hidden in a drawer became a promise. The Ottoman state had once managed diversity through layered belonging, but nationalism asked people to choose. It transformed mixed landscapes into claims. It turned old coexistence into contested history. This did not mean that all people hated one another or that separation was inevitable everywhere. Many continued to live side by side with practical tolerance, friendship, interdependence, and shared local habits. History is never only conflict. Even in times of rising nationalism, people borrow tools, trade goods, attend one another's celebrations, share wells, and mourn familiar faces. But politics has a way of reaching into ordinary life. Once borders begin to move, everyone asks where they will stand when the movement stops. By the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire still held important Balkan territories, yet its grip felt uncertain. The empire had lost too much to believe that the old order could simply continue. The Balkans had become a place where every crisis might become international, every reform might be judged by Europe, and every community might imagine a different future. From the palace in Istanbul, the map looked thinner. From the refugee camps and crowded neighborhoods, the past felt broken. From the schools and churches of the Balkans, the future sounded national. The empire was being asked to perform an impossible task, to remain a multi-ethnic imperial state in an age when more and more people believed that history itself demanded nation-states. Some Ottoman leaders responded with reform. Some responded with suspicion. Some responded with centralization. Some responded with religious solidarity. All of them felt the ground shifting. And in 1876, as debt, war, revolt, and fear gathered around the imperial throne, a new sultan came to power. He would rule for decades. He would modernize and censor, build railways and spy networks, speak of Islamic unity, and fear conspiracy in every shadow. His name was Abdulhamid II. Under him, the empire would become quieter on the surface, but more anxious within, like a palace where every whisper might be written down before dawn. In 1876, a new sultan came to the Ottoman throne at a moment when the empire seemed to be surrounded by closing doors. His name was Abdulhamid II. He inherited not a calm empire, but a wounded one. The treasury was strained. Foreign debt had become a heavy chain. The Balkans were restless. European powers watched every Ottoman weakness with predatory patience. Reformers argued that only a constitution could save the state. Conservatives feared that too much change would dissolve the old order completely. Soldiers worried about Russia. Bureaucrats worried about bankruptcy. Ordinary people worried about bread, taxes, sons taken for service, and rumors from provinces they might never see. Abdulhamid came to power in an atmosphere of crisis, and crisis shaped the man he became. At first, there was hope. In the same year he became Sultan, the Ottoman Empire proclaimed a constitution. A parliament was opened. Reformers believed that this might be the beginning of a new age, one in which the empire could become a modern constitutional monarchy. If all subjects could be represented, perhaps they could be held together. If Muslims, Christians, Jews, Turks, Arabs, Armenians, Greeks, Slavs, Albanians, and others could see themselves inside one political house, perhaps the empire might survive the age of nationalism. The dream was fragile, but it was real. Imagine Istanbul in that moment. In government offices, men spoke of law and representation. In coffee houses, newspapers passed from hand to hand. In private homes, intellectuals whispered that perhaps the empire had finally found a path between old absolutism and foreign domination. The new parliament seemed to offer a way to give voice to the empire's many peoples without breaking the state apart. But history does not always allow experiments to mature. War came quickly. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 and 1878 struck the empire with devastating force. Russian armies advanced. Refugees flooded roads. The empire suffered humiliation and territorial loss. The Congress of Berlin revised the peace, but it could not hide the truth. The Ottoman Empire had been badly wounded. Its European lands were reduced. Its weakness had been displayed before the world. Abdulhamid looked at the disaster and drew his own conclusion. In his mind, too much openness had not saved the empire. Debate had not stopped Russia. Parliament had not protected the frontiers. Liberty had not produced unity. The state was in danger, and danger demanded control. He suspended the parliament. The constitutional experiment faded into silence. For the next 3 decades, Abdulhamid ruled as an autocrat. He was not a lazy ruler. He was not a drunken palace ornament. He was intelligent, hardworking, cautious, and deeply attentive to detail. He read reports. He followed provincial matters. He understood the empire's weaknesses with painful clarity. He knew that the state was surrounded by ambitious powers and divided by internal tensions. He believed that enemies existed everywhere, in foreign embassies, revolutionary committees, nationalist schools, military circles, newspapers, minority movements, secret societies, and perhaps even inside his own bureaucracy. The result was an empire of suspicion. Reports flowed toward the palace like streams running downhill. Informers watched officials, teachers, officers, writers, students, merchants, and religious figures. Censorship tightened around newspapers and books. Words became dangerous. The state feared not only rebellion, but the imagination that might produce rebellion. A phrase in an article, a joke in a coffee house, a foreign pamphlet, or a student conversation could become a matter of official concern. In this atmosphere, silence became a form of survival. People learned to lower their voices. Writers learned to hide meaning. Officials learned caution. Students learned that ideas could be watched. The palace became the center of a nervous web, and Abdulhamid sat within it, reading, judging, suspecting. Yet it would be too simple to imagine his reign as nothing but darkness. Abdulhamid's empire was suspicious, but it was also modernizing. This is one of the contradictions that makes the late Ottoman world so fascinating. The same sultan who censored newspapers also built schools. The same ruler who feared political discussion expanded telegraph lines. The same palace that watched its subjects carefully supported railways, military reform, administrative growth, and technical education. The empire under Abdulhamid did not stop changing. In many ways, it changed rapidly. Railways extended deeper into Ottoman lands. Telegraph wires connected distant provinces to the capital. New schools trained officers, doctors, administrators, and professionals. The state sought to reach places that earlier governments had ruled more loosely. A message that once took weeks could now travel in hours. A provincial event could be reported to Istanbul with new speed. A governor could no longer pretend to be as distant from the palace as his predecessors had been. Modern communication strengthened the state, but also strengthened surveillance. A telegraph line can carry an order to build a bridge. It can also carry the name of a suspected dissident. A school can train engineers. It can also produce young men who ask why their empire is ruled without liberty. Abdulhamid understood both sides and feared the second, even as he needed the first. One of the most famous projects of his reign was the Hejaz Railway. It was designed to connect Damascus to the holy cities of Arabia, especially Medina, with dreams of reaching Mecca. The railway had practical purposes. It could move pilgrims more safely and efficiently. It could help transport soldiers. It could strengthen Ottoman control over distant Arab provinces. But it was also symbolic. Abdulhamid emphasized his role not only as sultan, but as caliph, the leader of the Muslim world. This became central to his strategy. Earlier, reformers had promoted Ottomanism, the idea that all subjects of the empire could share a common imperial identity regardless of religion. Abdulhamid did not completely abandon this language, but his deepest emphasis shifted toward Islamic solidarity. As Christian-majority provinces broke away and Muslim refugees poured into the remaining lands, the empire's Muslim identity became more politically important. The Sultan Caliph presented himself as the protector of Muslims, not only inside the empire, but across the world. This message reached Muslims living under British, French, Russian, and Dutch rule. It reminded European empires that the Ottoman Sultan had spiritual influence beyond his shrinking borders. For many Ottoman Muslims, this appeal had power. After the losses in the Balkans, after the humiliation of European intervention, after the arrival of refugees carrying stories of suffering, the language of Islamic unity offered comfort and strength. It told them that the empire still had a sacred mission. It told them that the Sultan was not merely a political ruler, but a guardian in a hostile age. But this same emphasis also deepened anxiety among non-Muslim subjects. Armenians, Greeks, and others wondered whether the promises of equality from the Tanzimat era were weakening. If the state increasingly defined itself through Muslim solidarity, what place remained for those who did not share that identity? Could they trust a government that watched them, suspected foreign connections, and feared separatism? The Armenian question became one of the most painful issues of Abdulhamid's reign. Armenian communities had lived within the Ottoman Empire for centuries. Many Armenians were merchants, artisans, farmers, clergy, professionals, and intellectuals. Some had benefited from reform and education. Some began to demand greater security, fair treatment, and protection from local abuses, especially in eastern Anatolia, where relations among Armenians, Kurdish tribes, Ottoman officials, and local powers were often tense and unstable. Revolutionary Armenian groups also emerged, hoping to draw attention to Armenian grievances and perhaps force reform or autonomy. To Ottoman authorities, these movements looked like another nationalist threat, another possible doorway through which foreign powers might enter. Russia's presence in the Caucasus intensified suspicion. European humanitarian pressure made the palace feel watched and cornered. Fear produced harshness. In the 1890s, terrible massacres of Armenians took place in several parts of the empire. The violence was horrific. Communities were devastated. The wounds entered memory and did not heal. For Armenians, the reign of Abdulhamid became associated with insecurity, terror, and betrayal. For the Ottoman state, the violence deepened international criticism and further damaged its moral standing in Europe. This tragedy also foreshadowed something darker that would come during the First World War. The late Ottoman Empire was becoming a place where fear could turn communities into suspected enemies. Once a state begins to see a population not as subjects to be protected, but as a danger to be managed, the road ahead becomes very cold. Still, everyday life continued beneath the pressure. In Istanbul, the city remained beautiful. Ferries crossed the Bosphorus. Minarets rose into misty mornings. Vendors sold roasted chestnuts, fish, bread, fruit, coffee, cloth, and small household things. The great bazaars hummed with bargaining. In wooden houses, families gathered in lamplight. In schools, boys bent over lessons. In offices, clerks copied files and stamped documents. In mosques, worshippers stood shoulder to shoulder. In churches and synagogues, communities preserved their rhythms. The empire was anxious, but alive. This is one reason Abdulhamid's reign is difficult to reduce to a single judgment. He presided over fear and censorship, but also over education, infrastructure, and state building. He resisted constitutional life, but strengthened parts of the modern bureaucracy. He feared young intellectuals, yet his own schools helped create them. That was his great paradox. The very institutions Abdulhamid expanded would produce the generation that turned against him. Military schools, medical schools, administrative academies, and technical institutions became places where young men learned science, strategy, languages, and modern political ideas. They read European thinkers. They studied the power of disciplined states. They looked at the empire's defeats and blamed not only foreign enemies, but the Sultan's autocracy. They believed censorship made the state stupid. They believed suspicion weakened initiative. They believed the empire could not survive if every honest voice was treated as a threat. Many of these men were officers. This mattered. In a declining empire, young officers often become political dreamers. They live close to the state's weakness. They see bad supply lines, poor training, corruption, outdated command, and humiliating dependence. They read maps not as abstractions, but as wounds. They know that one more war can erase another province. They begin to believe that saving the nation, or the empire, may require more than obedience. These young men became part of the movement remembered as the Young Turks. The name covered different groups and ideas. Some wanted constitutional liberty, some wanted stronger centralization, some believed in Ottoman unity among all peoples, some increasingly leaned toward Turkish nationalism, some were idealists, some were conspirators, some were future authoritarians wearing the language of freedom. But they shared one conviction: Abdulhamid's rule could not save the empire. The empire, they believed, was being smothered by fear. By the early 20th century, opposition networks were especially active among officers in Macedonia, one of the empire's most sensitive remaining Balkan regions. There, Ottoman officers stood amid competing nationalist movements, foreign intervention, guerrilla violence, and diplomatic pressure. They could see, more clearly than anyone in the palace, that the European provinces might soon be lost. To them, restoring the constitution was not merely a liberal dream. It was an emergency measure. They believed a constitutional regime could unite the empire's peoples, restore legitimacy, and prevent European powers from carving away more land. Whether this belief was realistic no longer mattered. It gave them courage. In 1908, the pressure broke. Officers and revolutionaries in Macedonia moved against Abdulhamid's system. The palace surveillance network, so wide and so feared, suddenly discovered its limits. It could read reports, intercept letters, and punish writers, but it could not control every mountain road, every military unit, every whispered oath, every young officer with a pistol and a map. The Sultan, who had ruled through suspicion, now faced the one thing suspicion cannot easily defeat: a movement willing to act. Abdulhamid restored the constitution. The empire erupted in celebration. For a moment, people believed the long night had ended. Crowds gathered in cities across the empire. Old enemies embraced in public squares. Muslims, Christians, Jews, Turks, Arabs, Armenians, Greeks, and others spoke of liberty, fraternity, justice, and a shared Ottoman future. Newspapers bloomed, speeches filled the air. The empire seemed to wake from a heavy sleep. But revolutions are often most beautiful before morning fully comes. The problems Abdulhamid had feared had not disappeared. They had only been released into the open. The empire was still indebted. The Balkans were still restless. Foreign powers were still ambitious. Communities still distrusted one another. Officers still feared collapse. Reformers still disagreed. National movements still dreamed beyond Ottoman borders. Abdulhamid's empire of suspicion had ended, but the age of danger had not. And the young men who promised liberty would soon discover that saving an empire was far harder than overthrowing an old sultan's silence. The Young Turk revolution began with a promise that sounded almost too beautiful for an empire so tired: liberty. For decades, that word had lived under censorship, hidden in private letters, whispered in military schools, carried in exile, and protected inside the minds of men who believed the Ottoman Empire could still be saved if only it could breathe. Under Abdulhamid II, the state had watched its own people with nervous eyes. Newspapers had been controlled. Parliament had been silenced. Ideas had been treated like sparks near dry wood. Then, in the summer of 1908, the sparks spread faster than the palace could smother them. The movement began in the empire's remaining Balkan lands, especially in Macedonia. This was no accident. Macedonia was one of the most troubled and important regions still under Ottoman rule in Europe. It was a place of mixed populations, competing national claims, guerrilla bands, foreign consuls, school networks, church rivalries, and tense Ottoman garrisons. Young officers stationed there saw the empire's weakness every day. They saw how foreign powers interfered. They saw how local nationalist movements undermined Ottoman control. They saw how little time remained. To them, Abdulhamid's autocracy did not look like strength. It looked like paralysis. These officers believed that a restored constitution could renew loyalty, improve government, and show Europe that the empire was capable of reforming itself. They imagined a state where Muslims, Christians, Jews, Turks, Arabs, Armenians, Greeks, Albanians, Slavs, and others might stand together under a shared Ottoman citizenship. They believed that representation could do what suspicion had failed to do. One by one, officers took action. Some fled into the mountains. Some joined revolutionary committees. Some sent demands. Mutiny began to take shape, not as a wild explosion, but as organized defiance. The palace could not be sure whom to trust. Units that were supposed to suppress rebellion might join it. Reports arrived too late or contradicted one another. The great system of surveillance that Abdulhamid had built seemed suddenly clumsy. The Sultan understood the danger. If he resisted and the army turned against him, his throne might fall at once. If he gave way, perhaps he could preserve his position. So, in July 1908, Abdulhamid restored the constitution that he had suspended decades earlier. Across the empire, celebration broke out. For a brief and shining moment, people acted as though history had opened a window. Crowds gathered in Istanbul, Salonika, Beirut, Damascus, Jerusalem, Smyrna, and other cities. Newspapers appeared with new energy. Political prisoners were remembered as heroes. Exiles returned. Speeches filled public squares. People who had lived under suspicion now spoke openly of freedom, justice, equality, and brotherhood. The scenes were unforgettable. Muslim imams, Christian priests, Jewish rabbis, students, soldiers, merchants, workers, and officials appeared together in public ceremonies. In some places, people embraced across communal lines. Old divisions seemed, for a moment, less powerful than the joy of release. The empire's many peoples spoke as if they had been given a second life. There are mornings in history when everyone seems young. The summer of 1908 was such a morning. But revolutions are often most innocent in their first hours. They are born in hope, yet they inherit every problem that existed before them. The Young Turk Revolution did not erase debt. It did not erase nationalism. It did not erase foreign ambition. It did not erase mistrust among communities. It did not return lost provinces or rebuild the treasury. It only changed the political air. And soon, the air grew heavy again. Different groups had celebrated the revolution for different reasons. This became clear almost immediately. Some Ottoman Muslims hoped constitutionalism would strengthen the empire and prevent further collapse. Some Armenians hoped it would bring security and equality. Some Arabs hoped for more local recognition and perhaps decentralization. Some Albanians wanted respect for their language and regional autonomy. Some Greeks and Bulgarians saw constitutional freedom as useful, but their national dreams did not necessarily end inside the Ottoman state. The revolution had given everyone permission to speak, but what they said was not the same. The Committee of Union and Progress, the organization most closely associated with the Young Turks, soon faced the central problem of power. It had been easier to oppose Abdulhamid than to govern an empire. In opposition, the language of liberty could unite many kinds of people. In government, every policy created winners and losers. Should the empire centralize authority to survive? Or should it allow more autonomy to satisfy its different peoples? Should Ottoman citizenship be emphasized above all identities? Or should the Muslim and Turkish core of the empire become more important as Christian provinces continued to slip away? Should the army dominate politics for the sake of survival? Or should civilian constitutional life be allowed to grow freely, even if it produced disorder? These questions could not be answered peacefully for long. The world outside the empire gave the revolution no time to settle. In 1908, the very year of constitutional restoration, Austria-Hungary formally annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina. This province had been administered by Austria-Hungary since 1878, but the formal annexation was still a bitter humiliation. Bulgaria declared full independence. Crete moved closer to union with Greece. The Ottoman Empire had barely celebrated its rebirth before more pieces of its old world were taken away. This was a cruel lesson. Europe did not pause because the empire had chosen liberty. Foreign powers respected weakness less than they praised reform. Inside the empire, political life became noisy and unstable. Newspapers attacked one another, parties formed, communities organized, old grievances resurfaced. The freedom that had seemed so healing now revealed the depth of disagreement. Men who had embraced in public squares found themselves arguing over language, education, military service, taxes, regional rights, and the meaning of Ottoman identity. Then came the counter-revolution of 1909. In Istanbul, conservative soldiers and religious elements rose against the constitutional order. The uprising was confused, emotional, and dangerous. Some demanded Islamic law, some opposed the influence of the Committee of Union and Progress, some resented military reforms and political changes. The capital trembled. For a moment, it seemed possible that Abdulhamid or his supporters might undo the revolution. But the constitutionalists responded quickly. An army from Salonika, often called the Action Army, marched on Istanbul to restore order. Among its officers was Mustafa Kemal, still a rising figure, not yet the founder of a republic, but already part of the military world that would shape the empire's final years. The counter-revolution was crushed. Abdulhamid was deposed and sent away from power. His brother, Mehmed V, became Sultan, but real authority increasingly belonged not to the palace, but to political and military leaders. The empire had crossed another threshold. The old Sultan's autocracy was gone. But stable constitutional government had not truly arrived. Instead, power became more contested, more militarized, and more anxious. The Committee of Union and Progress grew stronger. It still used the language of reform and progress, but as threats multiplied, it became less tolerant of opposition. This was one of the sad patterns of the late Ottoman state. The more danger it faced, the more control it wanted. The more control it imposed, the more suspicion it created. The more suspicion grew, the more the state believed control was necessary. Liberty had opened the door, but fear walked through with it. The empire's leaders looked at the map and saw danger everywhere. The Balkans were unstable. Russia remained a threat. Britain and France had their own ambitions. Italy, newly unified and eager for imperial prestige, looked toward Ottoman North Africa. Arab provinces were restless in quiet and varied ways. Armenian hopes and fears remained unresolved. Albanian unrest challenged centralization. The treasury was strained. The army needed reform. The old imperial structure seemed to be running out of time. Then Italy struck. In 1911, Italian forces attacked Ottoman Libya. The Ottoman Empire still formally ruled Tripolitania and Cyrenaica, but its ability to defend those North African provinces was weak. The Italian navy controlled the sea lanes. Ottoman forces could not easily send large reinforcements across the Mediterranean. A few determined Ottoman officers traveled secretly to organize resistance, including Mustafa Kemal and Enver Bey, who would later become Enver Pasha. In the deserts of Libya, local fighters and Ottoman officers resisted as best they could. There were moments of courage, improvisation, and hardship, but the larger balance was against them. Italy had ships, modern equipment, and geographic advantage. The Ottoman Empire had distance, limited resources, and too many other problems. The war ended with Ottoman loss. Libya slipped away. The empire had lost its last significant North African province, but worse was coming. Even before the Libyan crisis fully ended, the Balkan states prepared for war. Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro saw an opportunity. The Ottoman Empire appeared weak, distracted, divided, and exhausted. Its army was reforming, but not ready. Its politics were unstable. Its enemies understood that a shrinking empire often becomes most vulnerable when it is trying to reorganize itself. The Young Turks had promised renewal. But renewal had not come fast enough. By 1912, the old Ottoman lands in Europe were about to face one of the greatest disasters in their history. The Balkans, which had been part of the empire's life for centuries, would be torn away with shocking speed. For the people of Istanbul, news would arrive in waves: defeat, retreat, refugees, lost cities, broken armies, and the terrible realization that the empire's European night was almost over. The revolution had begun with songs of liberty. It now moved toward the sound of trains crowded with the homeless, soldiers marching through mud, and maps being redrawn by hands that no longer trembled when cutting Ottoman territory away. The morning of 1908 had been bright, but the twilight was deepening. The Ottoman Empire did not lose its remaining European lands slowly in the Balkan Wars. It lost them like a man waking from a fever to find that rooms of his house had vanished in the night. For centuries, the Balkans had been part of the Ottoman world. These lands were not a remote border forgotten by the capital. They were old imperial ground. They had given the empire soldiers, officials, merchants, poets, governors, rebels, farmers, scholars, and entire cities that carried Ottoman memory in their stones. Salonika, Edirne, Monastir, Skopje, Pristina, and countless towns and villages had lived under Ottoman rule for generations. Mosques, churches, synagogues, bazaars, bridges, bathhouses, military barracks, and government offices stood together in a landscape where the empire had once seemed permanent. By 1912, permanence had become an illusion. The Balkan states saw Ottoman weakness with clear eyes. Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro had their own ambitions, their own grievances, their own memories of Ottoman rule, and their own visions of national expansion. They did not agree on everything. In fact, they distrusted one another deeply. But for a moment, their interests aligned. The old empire was wounded. Its army was divided by politics and reform. Its government was distracted. Its North African war against Italy had exposed weakness. Its enemies believed the time had come. In October 1912, the Balkan League attacked. The speed of Ottoman defeat shocked even those who expected Ottoman weakness. Armies advanced across fronts that had once seemed defendable. Fortresses were threatened. Lines broke. Communications failed. Commanders struggled. Soldiers retreated through mud, cold, confusion, hunger, and fear. The Ottoman military, still in the middle of reform and damaged by political division, could not withstand the coordinated assault. News reached Istanbul in fragments. A town lost, a road cut, a unit surrounded, a railway station abandoned, a city in danger. At first, some people refused to believe the scale of the disaster. Empires often protect themselves with disbelief during the first days of collapse. Surely the army would recover. Surely reinforcements would arrive. Surely the enemy advance would slow. Surely Edirne, the old Ottoman capital before Constantinople, would hold. Surely the empire could not lose in weeks what it had ruled for centuries. But the reports kept coming. The Ottoman state lost nearly all of its remaining European territory, except a small area near Istanbul and eastern Thrace. The map changed with terrifying speed. Old Ottoman Europe, already reduced by earlier losses, was now almost gone. To understand the emotional force of this event, we must pause and remember what the Balkans meant to the empire. The Ottoman Empire was not born as a modern Turkish nation-state in Anatolia. It became powerful by crossing into Europe early in its history. For centuries, the Balkans were central to its military, political, and cultural life. Many families who thought of themselves as Ottoman had roots there. Many officers of the late empire had been educated or stationed there. The Young Turk movement itself had found strength in the Balkan military environment. The region was not a colonial afterthought. It was part of the empire's identity. When Salonika fell to Greece, the loss struck with special force. Salonika was a vibrant, cosmopolitan city, home to Muslims, Jews, Christians, merchants, workers, officials, and students. It was also the birthplace of Mustafa Kemal. Its loss was not merely strategic, it was intimate. A city filled with Ottoman memories was suddenly outside the empire. For people who had lived there, the change was not an abstract diplomatic fact. It meant new flags, new authorities, new fears, new hopes, and the beginning of uncertain futures. Again, as in earlier wars, refugees moved. This may be the most haunting image of the Balkan Wars, roads filled with people leaving homes they might never see again. Muslim families fled from Macedonia, Kosovo, Thrace, and other regions. Some escaped violence. Some feared revenge. Some were pushed by changing authority. Some simply followed others because staying felt impossible. They came with carts, animals, bundles, children, old parents, documents, carpets, copper pots, and keys. Always keys. A key is a small object, but in refugee memory, it can become heavier than iron. It says that there was once a door, and behind that door a room, and inside that room, a life. The Ottoman heartlands received wave after wave of displaced people. Their arrival deepened the empire's grief and anger. Stories of atrocities, humiliation, lost property, and abandoned cemeteries traveled with them. These stories shaped politics. They sharpened the fear that if the empire continued to shrink, Muslims in other regions might face the same fate. They made coexistence harder. They made trust thinner. The Balkan Wars revealed a cruel truth about modern nationalism in mixed lands. National armies did not simply defeat imperial armies. They also transformed the lives of civilians. Villages that had once been complicated places of shared markets and uneasy coexistence became zones of suspicion. A neighbor's language could become evidence. A church, a mosque, or a school could become a symbol of claim. People who had lived side by side under imperial hierarchy now found themselves sorted into national futures that did not always have room for them. The empire that had once governed diversity through negotiation, inequality, and local compromise now watched diversity become a battlefield. This does not mean the old Ottoman system had been peaceful or just for everyone. It had its own violence and hierarchies, but the new age brought a different kind of danger. It demanded borders. It demanded national majorities. It demanded loyalty to states that were still being formed. In places where people were mixed together like threads in a carpet, the drawing of a new border could feel like tearing the fabric apart. In Istanbul, the disaster helped produce a political rupture. The Ottoman government seemed discredited by defeat. Anger rose against leaders seen as weak or incompetent. In January 1913, members of the Committee of Union and Progress carried out a coup, forcing their way into power more directly. This event, often remembered as the Raid on the Sublime Porte, marked a turning point. The empire moved further away from open constitutional pluralism and closer to rule by a determined, anxious, and increasingly authoritarian leadership. The men who came to dominate the state included Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Shemal Pasha. They were not old palace figures drifting through ceremony. They were energetic, modern, ambitious, and deeply marked by catastrophe. They had seen the empire humiliated repeatedly. They believed weakness invited partition. They believed hesitation was deadly. They wanted centralization, discipline, military revival, and national renewal. But they governed in fear. Fear of Russia, fear of Britain, fear of France, fear of separatism, fear of internal betrayal, fear that the empire's remaining territories would be carved apart just as the Balkans had been carved away. Fear can make leaders bold, but boldness born from fear can be reckless. The Balkan Wars also changed the emotional center of the Ottoman state. The dream of a broad Ottoman identity, shared equally by many peoples, became harder to defend. After so many Christian-majority Balkan territories left the empire, and after so many Muslim refugees arrived with memories of suffering, many leaders and citizens began to think increasingly in terms of a Muslim and Turkish core. Ottomanism did not vanish overnight, but it lost warmth. It became an idea spoken in official language while reality moved elsewhere. The empire had become smaller, more frightened, and more concentrated. It still ruled Arab provinces. It still held Anatolia. It still possessed the imperial capital. It still had armies, ministries, schools, railways, and the dignity of an ancient state. But it had lost the confidence that a diverse imperial future could be preserved by reform alone. Then, in 1913, the Second Balkan conflict erupted among the victors themselves. Bulgaria fought its former allies over the division of conquered lands. The Ottoman Empire used the opportunity to retake Edirne, the old city that had once been an Ottoman capital. This recovery mattered emotionally. It gave the empire a small taste of restoration after humiliation. Edirne was back under Ottoman control, but this success could not hide the larger reality. The empire's European world was gone. The Balkan Wars were a rehearsal for the greater catastrophe approaching Europe. They showed how quickly alliances could form, how rapidly armies could move, how civilians could be displaced, how nationalism and military planning could ignite old grievances, and how fragile empires had become in the modern age. In the summer of 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo set Europe on the road to a general war. The Ottoman Empire watched carefully. Its leaders knew that a European war might create danger, but also opportunity. Perhaps Germany, strong and disciplined, might win. Perhaps alliance with Germany could restore Ottoman prestige. Perhaps Russia could be defeated. Perhaps lost lands could be recovered. Perhaps the empire could escape the long humiliation of dependence. Perhaps. That word has led many states into disaster. The Ottoman leaders faced a terrible choice. Neutrality might preserve the empire for a while, but what would happen after the war? If Russia, Britain, and France won without Ottoman help, would they respect Ottoman territory, or would they divide it at last? If Germany won and the Ottomans had stayed neutral, would the empire miss its only chance to recover strength? The men in power believed they were gambling for survival, but the empire they led was exhausted, indebted, wounded, and filled with refugees. Its army had moments of courage and reform, but also deep weaknesses. Its society had endured decades of crisis. Its politics were tense. Its provinces were restless. Its enemies were powerful. The last European night of the Ottoman Empire had passed in fire, snow, mud, and exile. Now the world itself was moving toward war. And when the Ottoman Empire entered that war, it would not be fighting only for territory or prestige. It would be placing the remaining life of a 6th century empire on the table. The old state had survived sieges, rebellions, reforms, debts, assassinations, and lost provinces. But the next war would be different. It would be industrial, global, hungry, and merciless. And it would ask of the Ottoman Empire a price that no aging empire could afford to pay. When the First World War began in 1914, the Ottoman Empire stood at the edge of the storm like an old house watching lightning gather over the hills. It had not caused the crisis in Europe. The assassination in Sarajevo, the threats between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, the mobilizations of Russia, Germany, France, and Britain, all of these belonged at first to another theater of power. Yet no empire so strategically placed could remain untouched for long. The Ottoman lands sat between Europe, Asia, the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, the Caucasus, Arabia, Mesopotamia, and the roots of empire that Britain, France, Russia, and Germany all cared about deeply. The Ottoman leaders knew this. They watched the war with fear, but also with temptation. Neutrality seemed safe only from a distance. If the empire stayed neutral, what would happen when the war ended? Would the winners respect Ottoman independence? Or would they see a weakened state, exhausted by decades of reform, debt, and defeat, as a prize to be divided? Russia still dreamed of influence over the Straits. Britain watched the routes to India and the oil-rich lands of the Middle East. France had interests in Syria and Lebanon. No Ottoman minister could look at the map and feel secure. Germany offered another path. Germany had trained parts of the Ottoman army. German officers advised Ottoman forces. German military power seemed disciplined, modern, and formidable. Some Ottoman leaders believed that Germany might win the war quickly. If Germany defeated Russia, perhaps the Ottoman Empire could recover prestige. Perhaps lost lands could be regained. Perhaps the humiliations of the Balkan Wars could be avenged. Perhaps the empire could stand again as a serious power instead of a patient waiting for European surgery. Among those most drawn to this hope was Enver Pasha, young, ambitious, confident, and touched by the romance of military glory. Enver believed that bold action could rescue the empire from slow death. He was not alone. Many in the Ottoman leadership feared that caution would only leave the empire isolated. Better, they thought, to gamble with a strong ally than to wait passively for partition. This was the final Ottoman gamble. In late 1914, the empire entered the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. From that moment, the old state found itself fighting across a vast and punishing geography. It faced Russia in the Caucasus. It faced Britain in Mesopotamia. It faced British imperial forces in Egypt, Sinai, and Palestine. It defended the Dardanelles against an allied attack. It struggled to hold Arabia. It guarded railways, deserts, mountains, rivers, and holy cities. It tried to feed armies, move supplies, maintain morale, and preserve order inside a society already worn thin by years of crisis. No aging empire could have asked for a harsher test. The first great catastrophe came in the Caucasus. Enver Pasha launched an ambitious winter campaign against Russian forces near Sarikamish. On maps, the plan looked daring. In reality, the mountains, snow, cold, hunger, poor roads, and inadequate supplies turned the campaign into a nightmare. Ottoman soldiers marched through freezing conditions that were as deadly as enemy fire. Men collapsed in snow, units lost direction, food failed to arrive. Boots and coats were not enough against the mountain winter. Many died without ever seeing the enemy clearly. Sarikamish became a white grave. It was not only a military defeat, it was a lesson in the cruelty of ambition when it ignores weather, distance, logistics, and the limits of exhausted men. Enver had dreamed of victory in the east. Instead, thousands of Ottoman soldiers vanished into cold silence. Then came Gallipoli. In 1915, Allied leaders tried to force the Dardanelles, break through to Constantinople, open a sea route to Russia, and perhaps knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. The idea was bold. If successful, it could have transformed the war. Allied warships moved toward the straits. Later, British, French, Australian, New Zealand, Indian, and other troops landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula. The peninsula became a place of suffering. There were cliffs, ravines, scrub-covered slopes, narrow beaches, heat, thirst, flies, disease, trenches, artillery, machine guns, and the terrible intimacy of men killing and dying within shouting distance of one another. The land was small, but the misery was enormous. Soldiers dug into earth that gave little comfort. Water was scarce. Bodies lay between lines. Attacks gained yards at terrible cost. Sleep came broken. Fear became routine. Yet at Gallipoli, the Ottoman army held. This was the empire's last great defensive victory. Ottoman soldiers fought with endurance and skill. Officers organized resistance under extreme pressure. Among them was Mustafa Kemal, whose calm command and fierce determination helped make him a figure of growing importance. Later, his role at Gallipoli would become part of the founding memory of modern Turkey. For the Allies, Gallipoli was failure. For the Ottomans, it was proof that the empire, though old and wounded, could still defend its heart. But one victory could not save every front. In Mesopotamia, British forces advanced from the Persian Gulf toward Baghdad. At first, they overreached. Ottoman forces surrounded a British-led army at Kut, and in 1916, that force surrendered. For a moment, the Ottoman state could celebrate another victory, but the British returned better supplied and better organized. In 1917, Baghdad fell. A city that had belonged to the Ottoman world for centuries passed under British control. In Palestine and Syria, the pressure grew. British forces under General Edmund Allenby pushed north. In December 1917, Jerusalem fell. For 400 years, the Holy City had been under Ottoman rule. Its surrender carried a symbolism far beyond its military value. Another sacred and historic place had slipped from the Sultan's hands. In Arabia, the empire faced revolt. The Hashemite leadership in the Hejaz, supported by Britain, rose against Ottoman authority. The revolt threatened the Hejaz Railway, the very line Abdulhamid had built as a symbol of Islamic unity and imperial reach. Desert warfare, tribal politics, British money, Arab ambitions, Ottoman garrisons, and shifting loyalties all became part of the unraveling. The empire had tried to bind its distant provinces together with steel rails. War turned those rails into targets. But the darkest wound of the Ottoman war years opened within the empire itself. The Armenian population had already lived through decades of fear, reform promises, revolutionary activity, state suspicion, local violence, and massacre. During the war, Ottoman leaders feared Russian advance and suspected Armenian collaboration with the enemy. In 1915, the government ordered deportations of Armenians from many regions. What followed was catastrophe on a vast scale: forced marches, hunger, disease, massacre, theft, separation of families, and the destruction of ancient communities. Women, children, old people, and men were driven onto roads with little protection and often no real chance of survival. Villages were emptied. Churches and homes were abandoned. Families disappeared into deserts, ravines, camps, and killing grounds. The Armenian catastrophe became one of the deepest wounds of the modern Middle East and one of the darkest legacies of the Ottoman Empire's final years. War did not merely defeat armies. It tore societies apart from within. The Ottoman leadership saw itself as fighting for survival. But survival, when mixed with fear and absolute power, can become merciless. Communities that had lived inside the empire for centuries could suddenly be treated as threats. The line between security and destruction vanished. The state that had once claimed to rule over many peoples now presided over the ruin of one of them. Meanwhile, ordinary life across the empire became harder with every passing year. Food grew scarce. Prices rose. Families waited for letters from sons who might never return. Villages lost men to conscription. Cities felt hunger. Disease moved through weakened populations. Refugees and soldiers crowded roads and stations. Horses, carts, grain, cloth, and labor were taken for the war. The empire was not only fighting at the front, it was being consumed in its kitchens, fields, workshops, and homes. By 1918, exhaustion had become stronger than hope. Germany was failing. Austria-Hungary was collapsing. Bulgaria surrendered, opening a dangerous path toward Istanbul. Ottoman armies were retreating or stretched beyond endurance. The Arab provinces were slipping away. Palestine and Syria were lost. Mesopotamia was gone. The treasury was broken. The people were hungry. The dream that alliance with Germany might restore Ottoman greatness had dissolved into defeat. In October 1918, the Armistice of Mudros ended Ottoman participation in the war. The empire had gambled everything and lost. The guns did not simply fall silent. They left behind occupation, hunger, grief, anger, and the question that now stood over Istanbul like a dark cloud. What remained of the Ottoman Empire? The Sultan still existed. The capital still stood. The mosques still rose above the Bosphorus. Officials still carried seals. Soldiers still wore uniforms. But sovereignty had become thin. The victorious allies would soon enter Ottoman waters. Foreign powers would discuss the empire's lands as though dividing an estate after a death. For more than 600 years, the House of Osman had ruled through conquest, law, ceremony, faith, and imperial memory. Now its fate would be debated by others. And in the occupied streets of Istanbul, beneath the eyes of foreign soldiers and the shadow of allied warships, the empire would begin its final passage from defeat to disappearance. After the armistice, the warships came. They appeared in the waters near Istanbul like dark shapes from another age, steel gray and silent beneath the pale sky. British, French, Italian, and other allied vessels moved into the straits and anchored before the city that had once commanded the passage between seas. Their guns were quiet, but their meaning was louder than cannon fire. The Ottoman Empire had survived the war only in name. Its armies were exhausted, its provinces were broken or occupied, its allies had fallen, its leaders had fled or lost power, its people were hungry, grieving, and uncertain. The Sultan still sat in Istanbul, the palace still existed, ministers still signed papers, officials still wore formal clothes and used the language of sovereignty. But real power had begun to slip away like water through open fingers. For Istanbul, occupation was both visible and unreal. The city had seen armies before. It had seen conquest, ceremony, rebellion, fire, plague, procession, and grief. But this was different. Foreign soldiers now walked through the streets of the imperial capital. Allied officers entered buildings where Ottoman officials still worked. Flags of victorious powers appeared near the heart of a defeated empire. The city remained alive, but its dignity had been wounded. Imagine the Bosphorus in those days. Ferries still crossed between Europe and Asia. Fishermen still cast nets. Shopkeepers still opened shutters in the morning. The call to prayer still drifted from the minarets. Women still bargained in markets. Children still ran through narrow streets. But beyond the surface of daily life, everyone knew that the old order had lost its protection. An empire can continue its routines after defeat. That is one of the strange mercies of ordinary life. Bread must still be baked, lamps must still be lit, clothes must still be washed, letters must still be carried. A grandmother still tells a child to come inside before the evening chill. Yet above these small continuities stood the unmistakable fact of foreign occupation. The defeated Ottoman government tried to survive through caution. The Sultan and his ministers hoped to preserve what they could by cooperation. Perhaps, they thought, if they avoided further resistance, the Allies would leave a small Ottoman state intact. Perhaps the dynasty could endure in reduced form. Perhaps the empire could lose its provinces but keep its throne. But the victorious powers were not thinking only of mercy. They were thinking of strategy. The Arab provinces of the empire were already slipping into new arrangements. During the war, Britain and France had made promises, agreements, and plans that would shape the modern Middle East. Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan would not return to Ottoman rule. They would come under British and French influence through the mandate system, a form of rule presented as guidance, but experienced by many as another kind of empire. The Ottoman world was being replaced by borders drawn in conference rooms. For the people who lived in those lands, the change was profound. An Arab family in Damascus, a merchant in Baghdad, a farmer near Jerusalem, a notable in Aleppo, a clerk in Beirut, a tribal leader in the desert, all now faced a future no longer tied to Istanbul. Ottoman officials departed. New administrators arrived. New flags rose. New languages of rule appeared. The old imperial order had ended, but self-rule did not necessarily follow. Instead, another layer of foreign power descended. In Anatolia, the danger was even more immediate. This was the heartland that many Ottoman Muslims now saw as the last refuge after decades of loss. Refugees from the Balkans, the Caucasus, and other regions had already come there in waves. Families who had lost homes elsewhere looked at Anatolia as the place that must not be lost. Yet after the war, even Anatolia seemed open to partition. In 1919, Greek forces landed at Smyrna, known in Turkish as Izmir, with Allied approval. For Greeks, the landing was connected to a dream sometimes called the Great Idea, the vision of bringing Greek populations and historic lands into a larger Greek state. Smyrna was a city of deep complexity, with Greek, Turkish, Armenian, Jewish, Levantine, and other communities living amid trade, memory, and tension. To many Greeks, it represented old claims and cultural connection. To many Turks and Muslims, The Greek landing felt like invasion, humiliation, and the beginning of another catastrophe, like the loss of the Balkans. The landing ignited fury. It confirmed the fear that the victorious powers intended not merely to weaken the Ottoman Empire, but to carve up its remaining body. In villages and towns across Anatolia, people began to ask whether submission meant disappearance. The old government in Istanbul seemed powerless. The palace could protest, negotiate, or plead, but it could not defend the land. Then came the Treaty of Sevres in 1920. It was one of the most severe settlements ever imposed on the Ottoman state. The treaty proposed to reduce Ottoman sovereignty to a shadow. Large areas would fall under foreign influence. Greek claims in western Anatolia would be recognized. Armenian claims in the east would be addressed. The straits would be placed under international control. The empire's finances, military, and political independence would be deeply restricted. To many Turks, Sevres was not a peace treaty. It was a death sentence written in diplomatic language. The old empire had lost wars before. It had signed humiliating treaties before. It had surrendered provinces, accepted foreign pressure, and endured insults. But Sevres seemed to threaten the survival of any independent Turkish homeland at all. It turned defeat into dismemberment. It made the fear of partition real. The government in Istanbul was too weak to resist effectively. Resistance, therefore, gathered elsewhere. In 1919, Mustafa Kemal traveled to Anatolia. He had been an Ottoman officer, known for his role at Gallipoli, and respected for his military ability. But now, he became something more than a soldier. He became an organizer, a political symbol, and the center of a national movement that rejected the surrender of the homeland. From the beginning, the movement had to be careful. It did not simply declare itself against everything at once. It worked through congresses, local defense groups, officers, notables, former soldiers, villagers, and religious leaders. It claimed legitimacy not from the occupied palace, but from the will of the nation. In time, Ankara became the center of this resistance. The choice of Ankara mattered. Istanbul was ancient, imperial, cosmopolitan, beautiful, and vulnerable to foreign fleets. It faced the sea and carried the memories of Rome, Byzantium, and the Ottoman dynasty. Ankara was inland, austere, Anatolian, and more defensible. It did not shine like Istanbul. It did not seduce the eye with domes over water, but it offered distance from occupation and a new kind of political meaning. The future was moving away from the Bosphorus. The Turkish nationalist movement built a rival authority. It formed assemblies, raised forces, negotiated when useful, and fought when necessary. It rejected the Treaty of Sevres. It refused to accept that the fate of Anatolia would be decided entirely by foreign powers and a weakened Ottoman government. The War of Independence unfolded across several fronts. In the east, nationalist forces fought Armenian forces and secured territory. In the south, they resisted French forces and local opponents. In the west, the struggle against the Greek army became decisive. Greek forces advanced deep into Anatolia, moving toward the nationalist center at Ankara. The danger became existential. If Ankara fell, the resistance might collapse. If the Greek advance succeeded, the map of Anatolia would be transformed. In 1921, at the Battle of Sakarya, the nationalist forces held. The battle was long, exhausting, and brutal. Men fought across dry hills and open ground. The fate of the movement seemed uncertain. Mustafa Kemal gave the struggle a harsh and simple meaning. Defense not of a line, but of the whole land. The Greek advance was stopped. The war began to turn. In 1922, Turkish nationalist forces launched a great offensive. The Greek army retreated toward the Aegean. Smyrna was recaptured, and then the city burned amid chaos, terror, and human suffering. The fire and violence of Smyrna became one of the tragic symbols of the end of the old mixed world of Anatolia. Greeks, Armenians, Turks, and others experienced fear, revenge, loss, and flight. As with so many endings of empire, victory for one side did not erase grief. It only changed who carried it. The human cost of these years was immense. Muslim refugees remembered lost Balkan homes. Greek families left Anatolia after generations. Armenian communities had already been shattered by wartime catastrophe. Villages were emptied. Houses changed hands. Cemeteries were left behind. The end of empire was not a clean line on a map. It was lived through burned streets, crowded roads, abandoned keys, missing relatives, and memories that would remain unsettled for generations. Politically, however, the nationalist movement had won. The Treaty of Sevres was dead. A new settlement would replace it. In 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne recognized the sovereignty of the new Turkish state. The dream of partition had been defeated. Foreign occupation would end. A republic would soon be born. But before the republic could fully rise, the old empire had to be formally buried. The Ottoman Sultanate, the institution that had carried the House of Osman through more than 6 centuries, could no longer remain at the center of political life. The nationalist movement in Ankara had no place for a ruler whose government had cooperated with the occupiers and accepted Sevres. The dynasty that had once conquered Constantinople now stood as a relic of defeat. The empire had survived the warships. It had survived the treaty table. It had even survived long enough to see a new Turkish victory emerge from Anatolia. But it could not survive the future that victory created. Soon, the last sultan would leave Istanbul by sea. Not as a conqueror, not as a sacred ruler, not as the master of 3 continents, but as a man departing from a city that had already turned its face toward another age. In November 1922, the Ottoman Sultanate was abolished. With that decision, more than 6 centuries of dynastic rule came to an end. There was no final charge of imperial cavalry, no last army gathered beneath green and red banners, no great siege of the palace, no sultan standing on the walls of Istanbul to declare that the age of Osman would end only in fire. The ending was quieter than legend would have preferred. It came through politics, votes, telegrams, documents, warnings, and the cold logic of a new power rising in Ankara. The last sultan was Mehmed VI. He had inherited an impossible throne. By the time he became sultan in 1918, the empire was already broken by war. The Ottoman armies had been exhausted. The Arab provinces were slipping away. The Allies were victorious. Istanbul was vulnerable. The state was hungry, indebted, occupied, and humiliated. Mehmed VI did not rule over the empire of Suleiman. He ruled over the ruins, left after the final gamble had failed. His position became more difficult with every month. The government in Istanbul tried to survive by cooperating with the Allied powers. To some, this looked like prudence. The empire had lost. Its army was weak. Its capital was under foreign pressure. Perhaps only careful diplomacy could preserve the dynasty and some fragment of sovereignty. Perhaps resistance would bring even worse destruction. But to the nationalist movement in Anatolia, cooperation looked like surrender. Mustafa Kemal and the leaders in Ankara claimed that the true will of the nation no longer lived in the occupied capital. They argued that the Istanbul government had accepted humiliation, especially through the Treaty of Sevres. They believed that independence could not be saved by a palace watched by foreign soldiers and surrounded by Allied influence. This was more than a dispute over tactics. It was a struggle over legitimacy. Who had the right to speak for the people? The Sultan, heir to the House of Osman, ruler by dynasty, tradition, and religious authority, or the National Assembly in Ankara, claiming to represent the Turkish nation in arms? For centuries, such a question would have been almost unthinkable. The Sultanate had been the pillar of the Ottoman political universe. Sultans had conquered, built, judged, appointed, dismissed, prayed, commanded, and symbolized the unity of the empire. Some had been brilliant, some weak, some feared, some loved, some forgotten by all but historians. But the institution endured. Now the institution itself had become vulnerable. The Turkish War of Independence changed everything. As nationalist forces defeated the Greek army and forced a new diplomatic settlement, the authority of Ankara grew stronger. Victory gave the nationalists what theory alone could not provide: proof. They had resisted Sevres. They had organized armies. They had held at Sakarya. They had advanced to the Aegean. They had done what the Istanbul government could not do. They had saved Anatolia from partition. After that, the Sultanate seemed not merely old, but unnecessary. Even worse for the palace, it seemed dangerous. As long as the Sultan remained a political ruler, foreign powers might use him against Ankara. The dynasty could become a rival center of authority. The national movement could not build a new state while the old imperial throne still claimed obedience. So the decision came. On November 1st, 1922, the Grand National Assembly abolished the Sultanate. The Caliphate, for the moment, was separated from the political throne and allowed to continue in a limited form. This distinction mattered. It softened the blow for some Muslims who still respected the religious significance of the Caliph. But the political sovereignty of the Ottoman dynasty was finished. Mehmed VI was no longer Sultan. He remained in Istanbul only briefly. Then, fearing for his safety and seeing no future for himself in the new order, he sought British protection. On November 17, 1922, he left Istanbul aboard a British warship, the HMS Malaya. It was a quiet departure, and because it was quiet, it feels almost unbearable. Imagine that morning beside the water. The Bosphorus moves under a pale sky. The city is waking slowly. Smoke rises from chimneys. Fishermen prepare their boats. Shopkeepers lift shutters. A baker dusts flour from his hands. A tram rattles through a street. Somewhere, a child is being dressed for the day. Somewhere, an old woman warms her hands near a small fire. Somewhere, an official hurries toward an office whose seals now belong to a fading world. And the last Ottoman Sultan leaves by sea. Behind him stand Topkapi Palace, where earlier sultans had lived within courts of ceremony, silence, ambition, and fear. Behind him stands Dolmabahce Palace, built in a later age to show that the empire could still appear modern and magnificent beside the Bosphorus. Behind him stand mosques, archives, schools, barracks, fountains, kitchens, libraries, ministries, and graveyards. Behind him stand memories of conquest, law, prayer, poetry, reform, rebellion, exile, massacre, and war. He does not leave as Mehmed the Conqueror entered Constantinople. He leaves under foreign protection. The symbolism could not have been sharper. A dynasty that had once made European kings tremble now depended on a British ship to carry away its last reigning sultan. Perhaps some people watched. Perhaps others did not. Cities are strange in moments of history. What seems enormous to the future can pass beside ordinary life almost unnoticed. A man buying fish might not turn his head. A mother might be too busy calming a child. A porter might see the ship and then continue with his load. People who had lived through war, occupation, hunger, and grief might have had little strength left for ceremonial sadness. The end of an empire is not always dramatic to those who are exhausted by it. After Mehmed VI departed, the Ottoman dynasty lingered briefly in religious form. Abdulhamid II was chosen as caliph, but he had no sultanate, no real political sovereignty, and no empire to command. He was a symbol standing in the doorway between worlds. In 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne recognized the sovereignty of the new Turkish state. Unlike Sevres, Lausanne was not a treaty of dismemberment imposed upon a helpless empire. It was the settlement that followed nationalist victory. It acknowledged the borders and independence of the new Turkey. Foreign occupation ended. The dream of partitioning Anatolia had failed. On October 29, 1923, the Republic of Turkey was proclaimed. Ankara became the capital. Mustafa Kemal became the leader of a new political order. The choice of Ankara was more than practical. It was an announcement. The new state would not be ruled from the old imperial city beside the Bosphorus. It would not define itself primarily through the cosmopolitan, dynastic, and imperial memories of Istanbul. It would turn inward, toward Anatolia, toward a national homeland, toward a future that claimed to be modern, sovereign, disciplined, and new. Istanbul remained beautiful, immense, and unforgettable, but it was no longer the capital of power. In 1924, the caliphate was abolished as well. With that final act, The religious political shadow of the Ottoman dynasty disappeared from official life. Members of the imperial family were sent into exile. Palaces became state property. The old house of Osman, which had ruled across continents, became a memory scattered through foreign cities, private grief, family stories, and historical debate. The Republic moved quickly to reshape society. It sought to secularize the state, centralize authority, reform law, transform education, and create a modern national identity. Religious courts and institutions were restructured or abolished. New civil codes would later replace older legal systems. The Arabic script used for Ottoman Turkish would be replaced by the Latin alphabet. Dress, language, surnames, calendars, schools, and public culture would be touched by reform. The new leadership believed that survival required not only political independence, but a deep break with the institutions that had failed to prevent imperial collapse. To supporters, these reforms represented awakening. To critics, they represented rupture. To many ordinary people, they arrived as a mixture of opportunity, confusion, pressure, hope, and loss. The Ottoman past did not vanish simply because the Republic commanded a new future. No past ever obeys so easily. It remained in architecture, cuisine, music, family names, neighborhood memories, religious habits, regional identities, and the emotional landscape of millions. It remained in the former Arab provinces, where new states emerged under British and French influence. It remained in the Balkans, where people remembered Ottoman rule as oppression, coexistence, heritage, or trauma, depending on family, nation, and story. It remained among Armenians, Greeks, Jews, Arabs, Kurds, Turks, and many others whose histories had been shaped by Ottoman centuries. When empires fall, they do not simply disappear. They become questions. Who belongs? Who was wronged? Who was liberated? Who was exiled? Who inherits the cities, the songs, the cemeteries, the houses, the recipes, the archives, the wounds? What should be remembered with pride? What should be mourned? What should be confessed? What should be left in silence because words are still too painful? The last sultan's departure answered one political question, but opened many historical ones. The empire was gone. The Republic had arrived. Yet the people who lived through the transition did not wake up in a clean new world. They carried the old one inside them. A former Ottoman officer became a Republican official. A refugee from the Balkans became a citizen of Turkey. A Greek family remembered Anatolia from across the sea. An Armenian survivor carried names of lost villages into exile. An Arab notable learned to negotiate with British or French administrators instead of Ottoman governors. A Kurdish tribal leader confronted a new central state that spoke a sharper language of national unity. A Jewish merchant in Istanbul wondered what the new republic would mean for minorities who had once lived under imperial pluralism. The end of the Ottoman Empire was therefore not only the end of a dynasty, it was the transformation of an entire world of belonging. The old empire had been hierarchical, unequal, diverse, negotiated, and imperial. The new age would be national, centralized, bureaucratic, and modern. It promised sovereignty and clarity, but it also demanded sharper identities. The last sultan left by ship. The city remained. The Bosphorus kept moving between Europe and Asia. The gulls still circled over the water. The evening call to prayer still drifted above domes and rooftops. Men still sat in cafes. Women still carried baskets through markets. Children still grew up beneath old walls without fully knowing how many empires had passed into dust before their birth. Istanbul had survived Rome. It had survived Byzantium. It had survived conquest. It had survived the Ottomans. Now it would survive the end of the empire that had made it imperial once more. Somewhere in the wake of the departing ship, the water closed behind the last sultan. There was no wound visible on the surface, only ripples, widening softly, then fading into the Bosphorus, as though history itself had taken a breath and gone still. The dynasty was gone. The Republic was waiting. And the long twilight of the Ottoman Empire had almost reached its final darkness. The fall of the Ottoman Empire is often described with one simple word: decline. It is a useful word, but it is also a dangerous one. It makes history sound like a road sloping downward, as if everyone inside the empire were merely sliding toward an ending they could not resist. It makes 6 centuries of life seem like a tired body losing strength. It makes the final century appear inevitable. But history is rarely so simple. The Ottoman Empire did decline in many ways. It lost wars, it lost provinces, it lost revenue, confidence, and independence. Its armies struggled to match the new military systems of Europe. Its treasury became chained to foreign debt. Its reforms came late, unevenly, and often under pressure. Its many peoples began to imagine different futures. Nationalism tore at its borders. Great powers circled its weakness. World War I broke what remained. Yet the final Ottoman century was not only a story of decay, it was also a story of effort. Inside the empire were men and women trying to understand a world moving faster than any previous age. Reformers wrote decrees and built ministries. Officers studied science, maps, and artillery. Teachers opened schools. Students learned foreign languages and new political ideas. Engineers planned railways. Telegraph workers connected distant provinces. Journalists argued over liberty and authority. Bureaucrats tried to create order from confusion. Families adapted, migrated, mourned, and began again. The empire was not simply dying. It was struggling to become something else. This is one of the quiet tragedies of the Ottoman Twilight. Many of the people who tried to save the empire helped create the world that would replace it. The Tanzimat reformers wanted to strengthen Ottoman rule through law, education, and equality. Their schools produced new generations who demanded more than the old empire could give. Abdulhamid II built railways, telegraphs, and schools to preserve his authority. Those same institutions helped connect opposition, educate officers, and spread modern ideas. The Young Turks wanted to rescue the empire through constitutionalism and centralization. Their revolution opened hopes they could not fulfill, and their later rule carried the empire into its last war. Again and again, rescue became transformation. Transformation became conflict. Conflict became ending. The Ottoman Empire teaches us that great states do not fall only because enemies attack them. External pressure matters, but it is never the whole story. Russia, Austria, Hungary, Britain, France, Italy, and other powers all pressed upon the empire. They took advantage of weakness, encouraged certain movements, demanded reforms, offered loans, imposed treaties, and pursued their own ambitions. But foreign pressure was most dangerous because it met internal fragility. An empire can survive enemies if it still believes in itself and if its people believe in a shared future. The Ottomans increasingly struggled with that second condition. For centuries, the empire had governed diversity through hierarchy and negotiation. It did not need all subjects to be the same. It could contain many languages, religions, and customs because it was not a nation-state. But the 19th century brought a new political imagination. People began to believe that a nation should have its own state, its own flag, its own schools, its own heroes, and its own future. For some, this was liberation. For the empire, it was a slow earthquake. In the Balkans, nationhood became rebellion, diplomacy, and independence. In Arab lands, new ideas of identity and autonomy grew in complex ways. Among Armenians, demands for security and reform collided with state suspicion and catastrophic violence. Among Turks and Muslims, repeated losses and refugee suffering hardened the belief that only a stronger national core could survive. Every community carried its own fear. Every fear made compromise harder. The Ottoman story reminds us that identity is not only an idea, it is also a shelter. When people are afraid, they look for the shelter that seems most likely to protect them. A village, a faith, a language, a nation, a dynasty, a republic. In calm times, people can live with layered identities. They can be Ottoman, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Greek-speaking, Turkish-speaking, Armenian, Arab, Albanian, Kurdish, local, imperial, and many other things at once. But in times of collapse, layers are often stripped away. Authorities demand clarity. Armies demand loyalty. Borders demand names. The old empire had allowed many identities to overlap. The modern world increasingly forced them to separate. This separation did not happen gently. It happened through wars, expulsions, deportations, population movements, and memories of violence. It happened through families leaving houses whose doors they still remembered. It happened through cemeteries left behind, languages silenced in public, songs carried into exile, and children growing up with stories of places they had never seen. The fall of the Ottoman Empire was therefore not only an event in diplomacy, it was a human weather. It passed through kitchens, fields, mosques, churches, synagogues, schools, barracks, ports, and train stations. It touched people who never attended a conference or signed a treaty. A shopkeeper in Salonika woke under one authority and grew old remembering another. A soldier froze in the Caucasus, not because he understood grand strategy, but because orders had carried him into snow. An Armenian mother walked a road from which her family would never return. A Muslim refugee from the Balkans carried a house key into Anatolia. A Greek family left Smyrna with smoke behind them. An Arab notable watched Ottoman officials depart and wondered what British or French rule would bring. A young officer in Ankara believed that to save the homeland, he had to break with the empire that had shaped him. History is made of such lives. Maps show borders moving, documents show treaties signed, but memory remembers footsteps. The Ottoman ending also teaches us that modernization is not always gentle. We often imagine modernity as progress. Schools, railways, science, law, newspapers, constitutions, parliaments, factories, and new ideas. All of those appeared in the late Ottoman world. Many brought real possibility. Yet modernity also brought conscription, surveillance, more efficient taxation, sharper borders, stronger states, larger wars, racial and national categories, and ideologies willing to sacrifice human beings for imagined futures. The world that replaced the Ottoman Empire was modern. But modern did not always mean kinder. It meant more organized. It meant more centralized. It meant that states could reach deeper into the lives of ordinary people than older empires often had. They could count them, teach them, draft them, classify them, move them, and sometimes erase them from the places where they had lived. The Republic of Turkey rose from the Ottoman ruins with determination, discipline, and a powerful desire never again to be helpless before foreign powers. It built a new capital, a new political identity, and a new vision of citizenship. It rejected much of the imperial past in order to survive as a modern nation-state. For many, this was salvation after the nightmare of partition. For others, it was a rupture that left old forms of belonging behind. Beyond Turkey, the former Ottoman lands became new states and mandates. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, and other regions entered the 20th century under new arrangements shaped by British and French power, local ambitions, and unresolved promises. Borders hardened. Monarchies were created. National movements grew. Conflicts over land, identity, sovereignty, and memory continued. The empire ended, but its questions remained. What is a nation? Who belongs inside it? What happens to people who do not fit its main story? Can different communities share a political home without fear? Can reform come early enough to prevent collapse? Can a state modernize without losing its soul? Can memory become wisdom instead of revenge? These questions did not disappear with the last sultan. They still echo wherever old empires have fallen and new nations have risen from their ruins. And now, as we return one final time to Istanbul, the city beside the Bosphorus, we can see the Ottoman story in a softer light. The domes are darkening. The water carries the last reflection of evening. Ferries move between Europe and Asia as they have for generations. The call to prayer drifts over rooftops. Cafes glow. Windows brighten one by one. The old stones hold more memory than any single book can carry. The sultans are gone. The Janissaries are gone. The imperial provinces are gone. The maps have folded into archives, yet something remains. Not the empire itself, but the traces of lives lived beneath it. The flavor of food, the curve of a fountain, the rhythm of a song, the shape of a neighborhood, the memory of exile, the pride of survival, the grief of loss, the architecture of power, the silence of vanished communities, the questions carried by descendants. The Ottoman Empire did not fall in one night. It faded across generations. It tried to reform. It tried to command. It tried to remember. It tried to become modern. It tried to hold together peoples who were learning to dream separate dreams. It fought too many wars, borrowed too much money, trusted too late, feared too deeply, and gambled too much. And then, at last, it was gone. But as the Bosphorus turns dark and the city settles into night, we may understand that the fall of an empire is never only an ending. It is also the beginning of many unfinished stories. So let the old maps fold themselves away. Let the names grow soft. Let the warships pass into mist. Let the last Sultan's ship fade beyond the water. Let the voices of soldiers, refugees, reformers, mothers, clerks, teachers, merchants, and children become quiet now. The empire has finished its long twilight. The city remains awake for a little while longer, and somewhere beneath the modern traffic, beneath the gulls above the harbor, beneath the lamps along the shore, there is still the faint echo of an old world trying to remain itself as history gently, patiently, and forever changed around it. Good night, and may your dreams be calm.